So I want you to imagine that you own a small apartment building.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. And you have this tenant on the second floor who they completely stop paying rent. Month after month, absolutely nothing.
A landlord's worst nightmare, basically.
Exactly. I mean, you own the building, you're paying the mortgage, your name is literally on the deed. So one Tuesday, you finally just snap. You kick their door down, grab them by the collar, drag them out into the hallway, and throw their couch onto the street.
Yeah, and if you do that, you are going straight to jail.
Right. You're going away for assault, breaking and entering illegal eviction. And here's the crazy part. If you call a judge, fill out some paperwork, and wait a few weeks, armed law enforcement officers will show up at that exact same apartment.
And they'll do the exact same thing.
Yes. They will physically remove the tenant, and it is entirely legal. And the question is why? Well, because you are living inside this, invisible, all-encompassing architecture. So today, we're basically breaking into the operating systems of the globe.
Which is such an intense way to look at it.
It is. We've got this massive, incredibly dense academic text on governing regimes in front of us, and our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the absolute bedrock of power, authority, and this really elusive concept of legitimacy.
Yeah, because it dictates almost every single thing you do. It really is an invisible architecture. And what makes this text so fascinating is how it forces you to look at that structural foundation, instead of just the paint on the walls.
Right. We totally take for granted that the police can evict someone.
Or that, a percentage of your paycheck just vanishes before you even see it.
Yeah, the taxes, it's just normal to us.
Exactly. But to understand why, the author suggests we look at how totally different regimes tackle identical, massive problems.
Right.
That kind of strips away the cultural window dressing, right? It exposes the actual operating system running in the background. And the COVID-19 pandemic serves as the ultimate modern stress test for this.
Oh, that is a perfect place to start. Because, every country on Earth faced the exact same biological threat at the exact same time.
The exact same virus.
Right. But the reactions were wildly different. The text points to New Zealand as one extreme end of the spectrum. They didn't just, suggest people stay home.
No, they mobilized.
Yeah, the government literally mobilized to physically distribute pamphlets to households, hanging posters everywhere. They outlined this incredibly rigid, multi-level lockdown system. They essentially pulled up the drawbridge.
They did. They imposed some of the most aggressive, strict lockdown measures anywhere on the globe, effectively closing off the entire nation.
Right. And contrast that with nations that adopted more of a wait-and-see approach.
Where the central government completely stepped back.
Yeah, they prioritized this concept of individual freedom, leaving it up to local mayors or even just individual citizens to assess their own risk, to decide if they wanted to isolate.
So we're looking at two different governing regimes facing the identical virus, but the application of their power over the populace is just unrecognizable from one another.
Which brings up a foundational question for me, because before we can even begin to debate whether the New Zealand approach or the wait-and-see approach was better or, more effective.
We have to actually define what this entity making the rules is.
Exactly. We use the word government all the time, but if you strip away the national anthems, the flags, the political debates, what are the actual building blocks of political power?
Well, the text provides a very stark, unsentimental definition. A government is a specific set of organizations operating with established rules and procedures that has the authority to exercise the widest scope of power over a defined geographic area.
Okay, widest scope of power. That implies a hierarchy.
Right.
Because there are other organizations with power corporations, universities, but the government sits at the absolute top of the pyramid.
They sit at the top because of one defining characteristic. And this goes back to the German sociologist Max Weber. He articulated this over a century ago, and it remains the cornerstone of political science today.
What was the rule?
Weber argued that governments are defined by one ultimate rule. They successfully assert a monopoly on the right to use violence.
Wow. A monopoly on violence? That sounds like something straight out of a dystopian novel. It feels incredibly brutal.
That sounds brutal on its face. But Weber wasn't saying governments are inherently evil. He was isolating the core mechanic of their existence. The state has the absolute final say on when physical force, or even just the threat of physical force, is acceptable within its borders.
Okay, I think I need an example to wrap my head around that.
Sure. Let's compare the state to another powerful institution. Think about a major religious organization. A church or a mosque holds significant power over its followers, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The leadership can dictate moral behavior, they can demand financial contributions in the form of tithes, they can even resort to the ultimate spiritual punishment and excommunicate a member entirely, cutting them off from their whole community.
But they can't physically enforce any of it. Like, a church can't dispatch an armed tactical team to your house to collect your Sunday offering.
Exactly the distinction the text makes. They have moral power, but they have zero rightful legal ability to use physical coercion. A government, however, claimed and exercised the right during the pandemic to physically padlock the doors of businesses.
Right. They sent armed police to disperse gatherings.
Yes, if you continually defied a government mandate, eventually people with weapons would arrive to physically compel your compliance. The state holds a monopoly on that action.
Let me throw a wrench into that theory, though. Because I'm thinking about the castle doctrine in the United States or, stand your ground laws.
Oh, self-defense.
Yeah. If a person breaks into my home in the middle of the night armed with a weapon, I don't have to wait for the state to arrive. I have the legal right to use extreme physical force, even lethal violence, to protect myself and my family. So if I am allowed to use violence, how does the government still have a monopoly on it?
That is actually the most common pushback to Weber's theory. But the text specifically addresses these exceptions. You have to look at what happens after the home invasion.
What do you mean?
You might use lethal force to defend your home. But the moment the dust settles, the state steps in to evaluate your actions.
Oh, through a police investigation and the court system?
Yes. The government will dissect the event. Did the threat actually justify the level of force you used? Was the intruder retreating? Were you truly in fear for your life? The crucial detail here is that the government sets the criteria for what constitutes self-defense, and the government makes the ultimate judgment on whether your specific act of violence met their criteria.
Ah, I see. It's like a referee in a hockey game.
How so?
Well, the rules of the game explicitly state that players are allowed to body check each other into the glass, right? But the players don't get to decide what a legal check is versus an illegal penalty. The referee holds the whistle, they watch the violence happen, and they alone have the authority to blow the whistle and say, that was legal or that was a foul, you're going to the penalty box. The government is the referee.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The state holds the whistle. They occasionally delegate the temporary use of violence to you under extremely specific predefined circumstances, but they never relinquish their authority to adjudicate whether you followed their rules.
That makes total sense.
But relying purely on the referee's whistle or the threat of the police showing up is a terrible way to run a country.
I mean, it seems like it would be incredibly expensive. If your only tool for compliance is brute force, you would need an absolutely massive standing army just to make sure people, stop at red lights or pay their income tax. It's exhausting.
It is entirely unsustainable. A regime built solely on the constant application of violence is brittle. It will eventually collapse under the financial and administrative weight of its own enforcement. What a regime desperately needs is for the population to simply want to obey the rules on their own.
They need voluntary compliance.
Exactly. And that brings us to the evolution of power into two distinct concepts: authority and legitimacy.
And we tend to use those words completely interchangeably in normal conversation, but the text treats them very differently. Let's break down authority first.
So authority is the clinical legal permission to exercise power. It is usually conferred by a foundational document, like a constitution or a codified set of laws. It is the written rulebook.
Okay, so it's the paperwork.
Yes. The text uses the example of Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which explicitly grants the federal government the power to regulate commerce among the several states.
So because that one sentence exists on a piece of parchment, the government can legally create massive bureaucracies.
Yes. That single sentence is the authority that allows the creation of the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA can dictate how airlines operate, mandate safety protocols, and ground planes, precisely because their existence traces directly back to the constitutional rulebook. They have the paperwork to prove they are allowed to give you orders.
But having the paperwork doesn't mean people are going to like it or, respect it, which is where legitimacy comes in. The text treats legitimacy almost like a psychological state of the nation.
It is entirely psychological. Legitimacy is the widespread collective belief among the citizens that the government fundamentally has the right to exercise its authority.
It's the perception of moral rightfulness.
Right. Weber's argument is that you can have all the authorized power in the world, but if the people don't believe your rulebook is legitimate, you will constantly face rebellion. The most stable regimes possess both clearly defined authority and deep, unquestioned legitimacy.
To make this concrete, let's look at how governments wield this combination of authority and legitimacy in our daily lives. And the most obvious example to me is taxation. I feel like taxes are the ultimate test of whether people believe the state is legitimate because nobody actually enjoys giving away their money.
Taxation is perhaps the most profound exercise of state power outside of war. We generally think of taxes as a utilitarian mechanism, right? The state needs money to pave highways, fund public schools, and build aircraft carriers.
Sure, basic revenue.
But the text explores how the authority to tax is utilized as a massive engine for behavioral control. They don't just use taxes to raise revenue, they use them to socially engineer society based on what the regime deems as beneficial.
You're talking about sin taxes.
Yep.
The text has a fascinating data point on this. It notes that back in December 2021, the average state tax on a single pack of cigarettes in the U.S. was $1.91. That's not a revenue strategy.
No, not at all.
That is a deliberate, targeted attempt to make the act of smoking so financially painful that lower-income populations are forced to quit.
Exactly. It is punitive taxation designed to discourage a specific behavior. But governments also use the exact same mechanism to actively encourage behavior. Consider the U.S. tax code's treatment of home ownership. For decades, the government has allowed citizens to deduct the interest they pay on their home mortgages from their taxable income.
Right, the mortgage interest deduction. It's treated like a sacred right during tax season. But why does the regime care whether I rent an apartment or buy a house? Why are they subsidizing my mortgage?
Because there's a deeply embedded philosophical belief within the regime that homeownership fundamentally alters a citizen's relationship with the state. The theory posits that when you purchase property, you become literally and financially invested in the physical fabric of the nation.
You suddenly care deeply about local property taxes, the quality of the neighborhood schools, zoning laws, local crime rates. You grow roots.
Yes. So they're essentially trying to manufacture a more engaged, stable civic population. They believe a nation of homeowners is more politically stable and financially secure long-term, which lessens the burden on the state's social safety nets later on. The government uses its legitimate taxing authority to financially nudge millions of people into living their lives in a way the regime believes strengthens the country.
And because we largely accept the tax code as legitimate, even when we grumble about how complicated it is, we follow the nudges. We buy the house, we stop buying the cigarettes. But behavioral control isn't always about moving money around. Sometimes, a leader just tries to use their platform to change our minds. The text brings up Teddy Roosevelt's concept of the bully pulpit.
The bully pulpit is a fascinating mechanism because it relies entirely on rhetoric and presence rather than legal force. It is the inherent authority of the executive office to command the attention of the media and the public, using that spotlight to actively shape the national narrative.
And the authors give a really good example of this.
They do. They provide a brilliant dissection of how this works by analyzing a speech from President Barack Obama regarding the DACA program.
Right, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was the highly controversial executive branch policy regarding undocumented individuals who were brought into the United States when they were children.
Correct. The core of the policy was the administration directing federal immigration officials to essentially change their priorities. They were instructed to focus deportation resources on criminals or recent border crossers, and to defer action on these specific individuals who had grown up in the American school system.
Now, changing enforcement priorities is legally complex, and Obama needed to generate widespread legitimacy for a move that basically bypassed Congress. He didn't stand at the podium and read off immigration statutes or legal precedents.
No, he used the bully pulpit to appeal directly to a shared national ethos.
He went straight for the emotional and moral argument.
He did. The text highlights his opening lines. "My fellow Americans, we are and always will be a nation of immigrants. We were strangers once too." He then goes on to explicitly define the boundaries of citizenship not by legal documentation, but by shared values. He said that what makes us Americans isn't what we look like or our last names, but our shared commitment to an ideal.
It's a masterful use of language. By framing the policy as the natural extension of a historical, moral ideal, he is trying to build legitimacy from the ground up. He's telling the public, we aren't just tweaking a rule, we are fulfilling our destiny as a good people.
He was actively attempting to make the public feel that supporting this policy was a moral imperative, regardless of the legislative technicalities. That is the essence of building legitimacy through the bully pulpit.
But this brings up a terrifying scenario. What happens when that shared commitment to an ideal shatters? Because looking at the landscape today, particularly in the US, we aren't just arguing about the tax rate on cigarettes or the priorities of immigration enforcement. We are increasingly arguing about whether the people sitting in the government are even legally allowed to be there.
This is a critical juncture in the text. It requires us to put on our analytical hats and look at the aftermath of the U.S. 2020 election purely through the lens of regime dynamics. The authors make a very specific, highly nuanced distinction about the nature of the legitimacy crisis surrounding that election.
It's more complex than simply saying, I lost and I'm angry about it.
Much more complex. Throughout history, voters routinely despise the policies of an incoming administration. They might think a new tax law is devastating to the economy, or a foreign policy decision is deeply immoral. But historically, they still acknowledge that the administration won the election according to the rules. They attack the substance, not the structure.
Right, they hate the laws, but they accept the lawmakers.
Exactly. True illegitimacy only occurs when a massive segment of the population believes the government has no legal right to enforce any law whatsoever because they attained power outside the authorized rulebook.
So the distinction is between attacking the substance of the government versus attacking the process of how the government was formed.
Precisely. In the debate over the 2020 election, the groups alleging that the results were illegitimate were not primarily arguing that the philosophical substance of the incoming administration was inherently unrightful. The core of their argument was mechanical.
Meaning what, exactly?
It was an allegation that the process itself was deeply flawed and unauthorized claims that local election officials acted inappropriately, that voting machines were manipulated, or that state legislatures' constitutional roles were bypassed.
Now, the text does point out that numerous post-election audits and court cases examined these claims and found them to be without merit, right?
It does state that neutrally. However, in the study of political science, the objective truth of the audits is almost secondary to the psychological reality of the populace.
Wow.
Yeah. The text cites incredibly sobering polling data from April 2021. It found that roughly 75% of Republicans, 50% of independents, and even 25% of Democrats indicated they believed the election was affected by cheating.
Half of independent voters questioning the mechanics of the election. That is a staggering vulnerability for a regime's foundation.
It represents a seismic tremor under the architecture we discussed at the beginning. If citizens cannot agree on how the rulebook is interpreted, or if they believe the referee has thrown away the whistle, the baseline legitimacy of the entire system begins to disintegrate. It highlights a deepening fracture over what constitutes authorized power.
Which leads me to a paradox. If a government's survival depends so heavily on strict adherence to the authorized rulebook to maintain legitimacy, what happens when a massive crisis hits? A world war, a catastrophic terror attack, a sudden pandemic. Crises don't care about the rulebook. If the government has to wait for a sluggish legislature to debate and pass a law, the country might be destroyed. How do they survive without breaking their own laws?
Well, they survive because almost all modern regimes build a self-destruct button for their own rulebooks into the Constitution itself. We call these states of emergency. It is a massive legal loophole. The Constitution explicitly authorizes the executive branch to temporarily ignore the constitutional limits on their own power during a crisis.
So the law legally authorizes the breaking of the law. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It sounds like handing a blank check to a leader who might not want to give it back.
It is extremely dangerous, and history is littered with regimes that died because of it. But from a functional standpoint, if the public feels a genuine existential threat like an invading army or a series of bombings, they will almost universally support these emergency measures.
Because fear overrides the desire for constitutional debate.
Exactly. People just want the government to act decisively to protect them.
Let's look at how this is structured in practice, because I imagine different countries put different guardrails on this blank check. The text looks at France, for instance.
France has a very specific mechanism. The French president is constitutionally authorized to declare a state of emergency, which grants sweeping powers to law enforcement. But that declaration automatically expires after just 12 days.
12 days seems remarkably short for a major crisis.
It is deliberately short. It forces the executive to immediately go to the legislature. If the president wants the emergency powers to continue past day 12, the legislature must vote to explicitly approve an extension. We saw this play out tragically but effectively after the horrific terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015.
The Bataclan Theater and the stadium attacks.
Yes. In the immediate aftermath, The president invoked the emergency. This allowed the French police to conduct massive, sweeping, warrantless searches of homes and electronic devices, actions that would be completely illegal and unauthorized under normal French law.
But because it was executed through the authorized emergency provision, and because the French public was in a state of profound shock and fear, the actions maintained deep legitimacy.
Right. The legislature repeatedly voted to renew those powers until 2017.
So France uses a ticking clock to keep power in check. But what about a nation that essentially lives in a constant state of tension? The text brings up Israel as a completely different model.
Israel is a fascinating and highly complex case study in emergency powers. Israeli law actually authorizes two distinct forms of emergency declarations. The first is legislative. The parliament can declare an emergency that allows the government to temporarily alter, suspend, or bypass almost any existing law, with one major, rather philosophical caveat: the emergency enactments cannot infringe upon human dignity.
Human dignity, that is an incredibly subjective boundary line. Who defines what violates human dignity in the middle of a war?
It is highly subjective and frequently debated in their Supreme Court. But the second form of emergency power in Israel is even more sweeping: executive decrees. Back in 1948, during the founding of the state and the subsequent Arab-Israeli War, the government issued an emergency defense regulation.
Okay, what did that do?
This regulation permitted the use of military tribunals to try civilians, allowed for sweeping administrative detention where suspects could be held indefinitely without trial, and authorized widespread curfews.
Wait, 1948, that was over 70 years ago. Has that emergency decree ever ended?
No. That specific regulation has been renewed by the government every single year since 1948. Today, it is primarily, though not exclusively, applied in the West Bank.
To live under an emergency decree for 70 years, I mean, it ceases to be an emergency and just becomes a permanent operating system.
That is the danger of progressive normalization. However, the text points out that within Israel, these emergency decrees generally maintain broad support and legitimacy among the voting public because there is a widespread, deeply ingrained belief that the nation faces constant existential security threats. The public willingly grants the government the authority to bypass normal legal frameworks because they prioritize physical security above all else.
But surely this reliance on emergency powers eventually hits a breaking point. There has to be a scenario where a leader uses a real crisis as a Trojan horse to permanently destroy the system from the inside.
Yes, and political science has a term for it: the constitutional dictator.
Ah, that sounds bad.
It is. The text provides the ultimate cautionary tale with Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. We have to go back to 1972. Marcos is the democratically elected president. The Philippine Constitution at the time was heavily modeled on the U.S. Constitution, and it explicitly granted the president, acting in his role as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the power to declare martial law in the event of rebellion or invasion.
So he had the paperwork, he had the legal authority.
He absolutely had the legal authority. Claiming that communist insurgencies and civil unrest threatened the state, he invoked the provision. He declared martial law. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, meaning he could arrest people without charging them. He shut down the media. And then he used those legally acquired emergency powers to convene a constitutional convention.
He used the rules to rewrite the rules.
Exactly. He pressured the convention to change the government structure, eliminating his term limits and granting himself sweeping legislative powers. He told the public, essentially, "The threats to our nation are so grave that I am the only one who can navigate us through this. I need total control to keep you safe."
Calling him a constitutional dictator feels like a complete oxymoron. It reminds me of sitting at a blackjack table in a casino. You're playing by the rules, you've got a good hand. Suddenly, the dealer reaches over, swats out the deck for one with only fives, and says, "Management just legally changed the rules of blackjack so the house wins every hand." Sure, there might be a tiny sign on the wall saying management reserves the right to alter the game, but invoking it completely destroys the entire purpose of sitting down to play.
That is exactly what Marcos did. He ensured that every despotic move he made was accompanied by a meticulously crafted legal justification. What began as a constitutionally authorized emergency response methodically morphed into a brutal police state characterized by massive corruption, human rights abuses, and military rule.
So how did it end? If he rewrote the rules so he could never legally lose, how do you get rid of him?
You can only rule by force for so long before the financial and social costs become unbearable. The emergency dragged on for over a decade, the economy tanked, and the regime became increasingly chaotic. Marcos lost the one thing he couldn't decree into existence: broad public legitimacy.
The people turned on him.
Right. They simply withdrew their consent to be governed by him. In 1986, the People Power Revolution, millions of citizens taking to the streets, finally forced him to flee the country.
The people ultimately took the whistle back. Now, this brings us to a concept in the text that honestly blew my mind, because it feels completely backwards to everything we just discussed. We've talked about authorized emergencies. But the authors highlight scenarios where the government engages in actions that are completely unauthorized by any law, yet the public views those actions as totally legitimate. How is that possible?
It is a brilliant contradiction, and to explain it, the text uses a surprisingly mundane, everyday example from the United States. In 1984, the federal government passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which effectively strong-armed every state into raising their legal drinking age to 21.
Okay, sure.
Now, some states wrote explicit legal exceptions into their local laws, saying it's okay for a 19-year-old to drink if they are in their own home under the direct supervision of a parent.
Right, the parent takes liability.
But not all states wrote that exception. In many states, the law is absolute. It is technically, legally, a criminal offense for a 19-year-old to have a glass of wine at a restaurant with their parents celebrating a graduation.
But the police aren't organizing tactical raids on local Italian restaurants to arrest families.
Precisely. Because there is a widespread, deeply held cultural sentiment in society that a parent supervising their young adult having a drink over dinner is perfectly acceptable behavior. It does not harm the state. So local law enforcement exercises an unauthorized power, the power of selective non-enforcement. They actively choose to ignore the written law.
Wait, so the police are essentially deciding which laws count and which don't on a whim. Doesn't that completely undermine the entire idea of a strict rulebook that we established earlier?
It creates a massive philosophical tension, yes. The police are violating their mandate to enforce the law. But here's the crux of it. Society views this specific non-enforcement as entirely legitimate.
So it's okay because we all agree it's okay.
Exactly. If a rogue police chief decided to enforce the letter of the law and started arresting 19-year-olds having wine with their parents at Thanksgiving, the public outrage would be deafening. The police chief would likely be fired. The public grants the state the legitimacy to selectively ignore the law when the law violates common cultural sense.
That is wild. We grant the state the right to break its own rules if we agree with the outcome. Does this psychological phenomenon scale up to bigger issues?
It absolutely scales up, particularly in the immediate chaotic aftermath of massive crises. The text references the days and weeks following the September 11th terrorist attacks in the U.S. Scholars have documented that various government agencies implemented surveillance protocols and detention strategies that technically violated existing constitutional orders and domestic laws.
Because they didn't have time to go to Congress.
Exactly. They acted with completely unauthorized power. But because the public was in a state of profound trauma and demanded immediate protection from further attacks, there was a broad, unspoken consensus that the government legitimately had the right to take those unauthorized actions to secure the nation.
But what's the catch?
The danger, which the text emphasizes heavily, is that actions tolerated during a panic often become the new permanent baseline.
Okay, we've explored strong states bending or breaking their own rules to survive. But what happens when the architecture just completely fails? What happens when a regime simply loses that monopoly on violence and the state collapses?
Then we enter the incredibly bleak territory of fragile and failed states. A fragile state is a regime where the government's ability to provide the most minimal conditions of law, order, and basic services has deteriorated to a precarious level.
Yeah.
The central government might still exist in the capital city issuing decrees, but they lack the actual power to enforce them in the countryside.
And a failed state is when even that illusion shatters.
A failed state is total structural collapse. The government is either entirely gone or it has been reduced to an empty shell hiding in a bunker. And the primary rule of political science is that nature abhors a power vacuum. When the official state vanishes, a shadow government almost immediately steps in to fill the void.
Like a gang or a militia.
Yes, this is an unauthorized, often violent group that takes over the daily functions of the state.
The text uses Afghanistan in 2021 as the primary case study for this.
It is a textbook example. Before the official U.S.-backed government in Kabul completely collapsed in August of 2021, the Taliban had spent years systematically operating as a highly effective, incredibly brutal shadow government across massive swaths of rural Afghanistan.
They weren't just a military insurgency hiding in caves.
No, they were actively governing. The text references reporting from a New York Times journalist who embedded in an area called Alangar in early 2021. The reporter detailed how the Taliban had established a complex parallel bureaucracy. They were systematically collecting taxes from farmers and businesses. Right. They established administrative committees that oversaw the operations of local public health clinics, dictated the curriculum in local schools, and managed the economic flow of local bazaars.
So if you were a shopkeeper living in Alangar in 2021, the official government in Kabul meant nothing to you. The Taliban was the government.
For all practical purposes, they were the state. They displaced the official regime because they could actually provide a semblance of order and adjudicate disputes, even if it was a harsh, extremist, totalitarian order, in areas where the official state could provide nothing but chaos. By acting as the state locally, they gathered the resources and legitimacy among certain factions to eventually march on Kabul and carry out a violent regime change, transforming from a shadow government into the actual, undisputed government of the nation.
It proves that people will often choose a brutal, predictable order over complete, unpredictable chaos. Are there other examples of this?
The text points to Somalia as one of the most prolonged examples of a failed state in modern history.
I remember the horrifying images of the famine there in the 1990s.
The state collapse was so total in the early 90s that basic human survival became impossible for millions. The U.S. military had to deploy under a UN mandate, not to fight a war, but simply to protect humanitarian workers trying to deliver grain, because local warlords, operating as shadow governments, were violently stealing the food supplies to control the population.
Just a complete eradication of state order.
Exactly. And while Somalia has stabilized somewhat with international help, the state remains deeply, tragically fragile. The text notes that as recently as 2021, the central government had to indefinitely postpone national elections simply because they could not guarantee the physical security required to facilitate a vote across the country.
Okay, so we've looked at democracies utilizing loopholes in emergencies, and we've looked at the terrifying vacuum of failed states. But now we need to examine regimes where unchecked, unaccountable power isn't the result of a temporary crisis or a collapse, but is the permanent, everyday design of the system. Let's dive into authoritarianism.
Let's do it. If we define representative governments by their ultimate accountability to the voting public, authoritarian regimes are defined by the exact opposite metric. They intentionally confer ultimate power to institutions that are completely shielded from popular elections.
Right.
This could take the form of a military junta, a hereditary monarchy, a council of religious clerics, or a single monopolistic political party.
But the text makes a really sharp, fascinating distinction that I hadn't considered before. It breaks authoritarianism into hard and soft categories. It's not just a monolith of comic book dictators.
It is a very important spectrum to understand because it dictates how citizens actually experience daily life. Hard authoritarianism is what we typically picture in our minds, a regime that makes decisions without any pretense of consulting the citizenry and relies on frequent, severe human rights violations, secret police, and terror to crush any dissent. Soft authoritarianism is far more subtle and insidious. A soft regime still firmly asserts its absolute right to rule without needing democratic approval, but it frequently seeks out public input. It tries to take the temperature of the populace, figures out what basic things the people want, and attempts to provide them to keep the population relatively content and docile.
It's the difference between a boss who screams, "Do this exactly as I say or you're fired," and a boss who says, "I'm still making all the final decisions and you can't challenge me, but let's have a town hall meeting first so you feel like your voice was heard."
Exactly. And to maintain this control, without having to resort to expensive, constant violence, both hard and soft regimes rely heavily on a psychological concept articulated by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky called manufacturing consent.
Manufacturing consent, so essentially state-sponsored brainwashing.
It is much more sophisticated and ambient than classic brainwashing. It is the deliberate structural shaping of the public's reality through state-coordinated programs designed to instill deep, reflexive support for the regime. The text uses Belarus as a prime contemporary example. Alexander Lukashenko has been the president of Belarus for over a quarter of a century.
He's been in power since the mid-90s, right? Often called Europe's last dictator.
Yes, and he maintains that grip on power not solely through the police, but through immense stifling control over the flow of information. The state controls the internet infrastructure and dominates the media landscape. If there are opposition voices, they're either silenced or depicted exclusively as chaotic, Western-backed traitors.
Wow, just total control.
Yes, if you grew up in Belarus, the entire media diet you consume from childhood constantly promotes a narrative of Belarusian independence and fierce nationalism, which is intricately and inextricably tied to the personal leadership of Lukashenko himself. By the time a tightly controlled election actually happens, the consent of the people has already been manufactured by the environment they live in.
It reminds me of the classic, vivid propaganda posters from Mao-era China. There's that famous imagery of crowds of citizens all painted with glowing, healthy faces, proudly waving their copies of Mao's Little Red Book. And the text points out that the book wasn't just a bestseller, it was strictly required reading in all Chinese schools. You literally could not escape the messaging.
You couldn't.
But I have to push back on this concept for a second. Is manufacturing consent truly unique to dictatorships?
Yeah.
Couldn't a critic easily argue that corporate algorithms on social media or massive billion-dollar PR campaigns by tech monopolies in Western democracies do the exact same thing? They curate what we see, they manipulate our emotional desires, they engineer our opinions, they just do it to maximize profit instead of maximizing state control. Are we really that different?
That is a very sharp critique, and it's a massive debate happening in sociology and political science right now. The mechanisms are indeed remarkably, uncomfortably similar. The curation of information bubbles, the deliberate appeal to tribal emotion over rational thought. However, the critical distinction that the source material makes is the state-coordinated nature of the propaganda, which is ultimately backed by the monopoly on violence.
Ah, I see.
A tech corporation might manipulate your feed to sell you a lifestyle, or even to subtly sway an election. But if you delete the app and walk away, the CEO cannot send armed police to your house to arrest you. In an authoritarian regime, the propaganda is the required national curriculum, and openly defying the narrative carries the implicit, omnipresent threat of state violence.
Okay, that makes sense. The underlying threat of a prison cell changes the equation entirely. Let's look at how these regimes actually function in the real world. What does a modern authoritarian operating system look like?
They take wildly different forms depending on their history. Sometimes it is direct, barely concealed military control. Look at Thailand. On paper, it looks like a standard democracy. It is a constitutional monarchy. They have a king, a parliament, a prime minister, and they hold elections. But the text notes that the military operates as a shadow state that has simply absorbed the official state.
They are the de facto governors.
They are. The military has launched numerous coups over the decades, and they wrote the current constitution to guarantee their power. In the 2020 elections, international observers thoroughly documented how the military systematically manipulated the electoral rules, dissolved opposition parties on technicalities, and appointed a massive block of senators to ensure that representatives favorable to the military retained absolute control.
So they put on the costume of a democracy to appease the international community, but the generals are holding the actual leash.
Precisely. Then you have classic soft authoritarianism, and the text points to Morocco. Morocco was a kingdom, and the king is the undisputed head of state. But unlike the King of England, who serves a mostly ceremonial role, the King of Morocco holds tremendous actual political power.
But didn't Morocco experience a massive democratic uprising a few years ago?
They did. During the Arab Spring in 2011, massive protests erupted across Morocco, demanding sweeping democratic reforms and an end to corruption. And this is where the soft strategy is perfectly deployed. Instead of sending in the military to violently crush the protests, which would have destroyed his international standing and potentially sparked a civil war, the king compromised.
What did he do?
He initiated changes to the 2011 Constitution, ostensibly giving the elected legislature much more power to pass laws, and he formally gave up his title as the head of the government.
That sounds like a genuine move toward representative democracy. The protests worked.
They worked to a degree, but the regime built a very hard, invisible ceiling over the new democracy. The king still personally appoints the prime minister. He remains the undisputed head of the military. He retains the power to veto any legislation passed by the parliament. And crucially, he possesses the constitutional authority to completely disband the parliament and issue legally binding decrees entirely on his own.
Wow. So he basically built them a democratic sandbox to play in, but he kept the deed to the property and can pave over the sandbox whenever he wants. How on earth does he justify retaining that level of supreme power to a public that just protested for democracy?
Through the immense power of religious and traditional legitimacy. The Moroccan monarchy is deeply intertwined with faith. The royal family claims a direct lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad. The king actively presents himself not just as a political ruler, but as the commander of the faithful, the ultimate defender of Islam within the nation.
Oh, that's smart.
It is a profoundly powerful form of traditional legitimacy. It makes it incredibly difficult for political opponents to criticize his power without simultaneously appearing to attack the religious foundations of the country.
That is a brilliant, almost unassailable strategic position. So that's soft authoritarianism using religion. What about the absolute extreme end of the spectrum?
For the ultimate example of hard authoritarianism, the text looks at the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. It is perhaps the most heavily fortified extreme authoritarian state existing today. The current leader, Kim Jong-un, inherited his absolute power from his father, who inherited it from his father, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the state. It is a communist dynasty.
And he controls every single lever of power.
Every single one. He serves as the general secretary of the ruling Workers' Party and the chair of the Central Military Commission. Now, theoretically, they have a constitution and a legislature called the Supreme People's Assembly, but it is the ultimate rubber stamp.
How bad is it?
The text points out that the electoral rules guarantee the ruling Workers' Party up to 90% of the seats, and voters are presented with ballots that have exactly one pre-approved candidate on them. There is zero political choice.
So how do they manufacture consent in a place where the suffering is so obvious? The crushing poverty, the famines, the hardship is well documented globally. How does the regime survive without the people simply revolting out of sheer desperation?
They survive through the imposition of an intense, all-encompassing state ideology called juche, which loosely translates to absolute national self-reliance. The state maintains an airtight seal on information. No outside internet, no foreign media. So the regime's narrative is the only reality that exists. To maintain unity, the government constantly stokes historical trauma and resentment.
By Duma.
They focus relentlessly on the brutal mistreatment of the Korean people by the Japanese Empire during World War II. They constantly broadcast reminders of the devastating U.S. bombing campaigns that leveled the country during the Korean War in the 1950s.
I see. They keep the population in a perpetual state of psychological war. The message is the entire outside world wants to annihilate us, and we are under constant siege.
Exactly. The narrative dictates that only the immense power of the Kim family can protect the nation from destruction. They have constructed a quasi-religious mythology where the ruling family is viewed as divine, infallible, loving parents protecting their children. The text includes an incredibly vivid detail that perfectly encapsulates this psychology. It describes a photograph of North Korean citizens diligently drying massive amounts of harvested corn directly on the paved concrete sidewalks in the middle of Pyongyang, the capital city.
Just laying corn out on the concrete in the middle of a major metropolis? That sounds desperate.
To the outside world, it looks like a sign of agricultural failure. But internally, the regime frames this traditional socialist farming practice as a triumphant display of mass resilience. The visual propaganda message is, we will survive typhoons, we will survive crippling international sanctions, we don't need anyone's charity, we rely only on ourselves and our leader. It takes the stark reality of hardship and psychologically twists it into a virtue of intense loyalty to the regime.
That is a staggering psychological manipulation, turning starvation into patriotism. So we have Morocco using religious lineage, and North Korea using this siege mythology of self-reliance. Are there regimes that manage to blend these totally different approaches?
Yes, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a fascinating example of blended authoritarianism. It is a theocracy that was born out of the 1979 revolution, strictly based on Twelver Shia Islam. The absolute ultimate political and military authority rests with the supreme leader, who is a top religious cleric, and a guardian council composed of Islamic scholars.
So the clerics have the absolute final word on everything?
They do. The Guardian Council must rigorously vet and approve every single candidate who wishes to run for any office, and they must approve every piece of legislation to ensure it aligns with Islamic law. However, within that incredibly strict, pre-approved theological boundary, the regime does utilize democratic mechanisms. The public votes in fiercely contested elections for a 290-member parliament and a president. There are actual vibrant political factions and massive public debates over economic policy.
It's a democracy, but only inside a steel cage built by the clerics. It is a fusion of hard, unyielding religious control and soft, managed democratic input.
Exactly. Authoritarian regimes rely on these complex mythologies, religious mandates, or brute military force to establish their legitimacy.
Right.
Representative governments, on the other hand, rely on a very different, much messier mechanism, the ballot box. But as we pivot to looking at democracies, the text reveals that democracy comes in wildly different, structurally distinct flavors, and some of those flavors have massive bugs in their code.
Okay, let's unpack the messy mathematical reality of representation. We tend to fall into the trap of thinking about democracy as a single, uniform product off an assembly line. People vote, the person with the most votes wins, they make the laws, end of story. But the text shows how incredibly varied the architecture actually is.
It is deeply varied, largely because of when and how these democracies were built.
Yeah.
There was a massive explosion of representative governments during what political scientists refer to as the third wave of democratization, which kicked off in the 1970s.
Right.
This wave swept across the globe, transforming places like Spain, Portugal, South Korea, and later Chile as right-wing military dictatorships, and eventually Soviet-backed communist regimes collapsed. But when these newly freed nations sat down to build their new democratic operating systems, they had to make profound structural choices based on their own unique histories and fears.
And one of the most foundational choices a new democracy has to make is how to distribute power geographically, choosing between a federal system and a unitary system. Let's break down the mechanics of that.
This choice dictates how centralized the power of the state will be. In a unitary system, power is intensely concentrated at the national level. The central government in the capital city makes the laws, dictates the educational curriculum, and sets the police standards for the entire country, from the biggest city to the smallest village.
So it's very top-down.
Yeah. The goal of a unitary system is national cohesion, equality of laws, and streamlined efficiency. It's a single powerful engine driving the entire ship.
And a federal system.
A federal system deliberately fractures power. You establish a national government to handle massive unifying issues like a national military, printing currency, and foreign treaties. But you also establish regional governments, states, provinces, or cantons that possess their own constitutionally protected authority to create distinct laws for their specific geographic areas. The central government cannot easily overrule them on local matters.
So, similar to the United States, where the gun laws or environmental regulations in Texas look entirely different than the laws in California.
Exactly. The text uses Canada as a superb example of why a nation would choose a federal system. Canada is geographically immense and culturally incredibly diverse. Federalism acts as a vital pressure release valve. It allows the province of Quebec to fiercely protect and retain its unique French language, its Catholic historical roots, and its specific civil law culture without the national government interfering. At the exact same time, it allows a province like Alberta, which is culturally much more Western, rural, and economically tied to the oil and agriculture industries, to govern itself according to its own regional priorities.
If Canada were a unitary system, trying to force one single set of social laws and economic regulations on both the French-speaking cafes of Montreal and the oil riggers of Alberta would cause constant, massive political friction.
It would likely tear the country apart. Federalism accommodates diversity. But there is another, much darker historical reason to choose federalism to prevent the rise of tyranny. After the devastation of World War II, when the victorious Allies, particularly the United States, were overseeing the reconstruction of the West German government, they absolutely insisted that the new German constitution be a strict federal system.
Because they were looking backward at the rise of the Nazis.
Precisely. Under Adolf Hitler, the Nazi regime systematically destroyed local governments and centralized all political, police, and economic power in Berlin, using that unitary control to devastating, horrific effect. The Allies deliberately designed the new West German government to be fragmented, granting strong protected authority to the individual states, the lender.
So they decentralized it on purpose.
Yes. They engineered the system to ensure that no national government in Germany could ever easily or quickly concentrate that much unrestrained power again. Federalism was built in as a structural defense mechanism against future dictators.
That makes perfect sense. You build speed bumps into the Constitution. So that covers how power is divided over a map. What about how the actual people in power are chosen? The text highlights the massive difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system.
This is where the actual mechanics of voting, the math of democracy, gets really interesting. In a presidential system, like the US or Brazil, the voters participate in two separate, independent elections. You elect the legislature to make the laws, and you independently elect the executive, the president, to enforce them. They possess separate mandates from the people and are designed to constantly check and balance each other. But in a parliamentary system, the voters only make one choice. They elect the legislature.
So where does the prime minister come from?
Whichever political party wins the majority of seats in the parliament gets the right to essentially form the executive branch. The leader of that winning party becomes the prime minister, and they appoint their colleagues to the cabinet.
That sounds incredibly efficient. If your party wins the parliament, you effectively control the entire apparatus of government. You don't have a hostile president vetoing your bills. You can pass your agenda immediately.
They're designed for rapid, decisive legislative action. But there is a massive catch. What happens if the vote is split and no single party wins an outright majority? This brings us to a deep dive into the state of Israel, which utilizes a unitary unicameral parliament called the Knesset.
Unicameral meaning there is only one legislative body, no Senate or upper house to act as a secondary filter.
Correct. The Knesset consists of 120 seats. Now, the voting mechanics in Israel are crucial to understand. You do not vote for a local representative who lives in your specific neighborhood or district. The entire country votes as one single massive national district. And you don't vote for a person, you vote for a political party.
Okay, proportional representation.
Yes. And here is the kicker. Any political party that manages to secure at least 3.25% of the total national vote is legally guaranteed a proportional number of seats in the Knesset.
3.25%. That is an incredibly low threshold. That means you don't need broad national appeal. You just need a tiny, highly dedicated sliver of the population to get a seat at the table.
And that is exactly what happens. Because the threshold is so low, the vote splinters into many different factions. You regularly have over a dozen different parties winning seats in the Knesset. Because the math is so divided, it is virtually impossible for one major party to win the 61 seats required for an outright majority.
So what do?
To form a government and pick a prime minister, the big parties are forced to form a coalition government. They have to desperately negotiate with multiple tiny parties, combining their seats together to try and hit that magic number of 61.
Let me walk through the math on this because the implications are staggering. Imagine I'm the leader of a massive mainstream political party. I win 55 seats in the election. I am clearly the most popular party in the country.
Right.
But I still need 6 more seats to take control of the government.
Right, you're short.
Yeah. And there is a tiny fringe political party sitting over there that won exactly 6 seats. Suddenly, that tiny party has all the leverage in the world. They can demand absolute control over specific ministries or dictate national policy, and if I don't give it to them, they walk away and my government collapses.
You have perfectly described the chronic vulnerability of the Israeli parliamentary system. This mathematical structure routinely grants wildly disproportionate power to fringe parties. The text notes that for decades, massive mainstream parties, whether it's the conservative Likud Party or the liberal Labor Party, have been forced to cater to the specific, often extreme demands of tiny, ultra-Orthodox religious parties simply to form a functioning government.
That's incredible.
In 2021, the math was so tight that a governing coalition actually had to rely on the inclusion of a small Arab Islamist party just across the 61-seat threshold. Because of the mechanics of the regime, a party that represents perhaps 4% of the population can effectively dictate national policy by holding the larger parties hostage.
It is wild that the pure math of a democracy can actually result in empowering the extreme minority over the will of the vast majority. It's a glitch in the code. Let's look at another highly complex democratic structure. The text spends a significant amount of time analyzing Mexico.
Mexico provides a fascinating contrast because it utilizes a highly blended system. They are a federal republic with a president, an independent Supreme Court, and a bicameral Congress. Their legislature is an intricate mix of voting styles. The lower house has 500 members. 300 of them are elected in local winner-take-all districts, very much like the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay, pretty standard.
But the remaining 200 members are elected through proportional representation across 5 massive geographic regions. It is a deliberate attempt to blend the direct local accountability of district voting with the broad ideological representation of a proportional system.
The voting mechanics are interesting, but what really jumped out at me in the text was the Mexican Constitution itself. We talked earlier about how a constitution is the ultimate rulebook that grants a regime its authority. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, it is relatively brief, and it primarily focuses on negative rights. It outlines the structure of the government, and then it lists things the government cannot do to you. It can't restrict your speech, it can't search your house without a warrant, it can't take your guns.
Yes, it is fundamentally designed to limit state power.
But the Mexican Constitution operates on a completely different philosophical plane. The text notes it has been amended over 200 times since it was written in 1917, and it guarantees an incredibly specific, expansive list of proactive, positive rights. The state isn't just promising to leave you alone, it is promising to provide for you.
It goes into a lot of detail.
It does. The text lists them out. The Constitution guarantees the right to a decent and socially useful job. It guarantees the right to quality nourishment provided by the state. It guarantees the right to a decent and respectable house. And my personal favorite, it literally includes a constitutional right for citizens to practice sports.
But it represents a fundamentally different approach to achieving legitimacy. The Mexican regime seeks legitimacy not just by protecting liberty, but by explicitly promising massive social, economic, and cultural uplift. They are telling the population, our rule is legitimate because we are legally obligated to guarantee your physical and economic well-being, not just your political freedom.
But here's my philosophical pushback on that strategy. If your constitution promises every single citizen a respectable house, high-quality food, and a decent job, but the state economy cannot actually afford to provide that, doesn't that inherently destroy the government's legitimacy?
It definitely strains it.
Right, because if you wildly overpromise and structurally underdeliver on that scale, the foundational rulebook of your country just starts to read like a work of utopian fiction. Why would the people trust a state that constantly breaks its constitutional promises?
That is precisely the crisis of legitimacy that the Mexican government is grappling with right now. The text explicitly documents a measurable, steady decline in governmental legitimacy in Mexico over recent decades. And it is not merely about failing to provide the promised decent housing or sports facilities. It is about a catastrophic failure to provide the absolute most basic function of a state that we discussed at the very beginning, maintaining the monopoly on violence and basic public order.
You're talking about the rise of the drug cartels.
Yes. In several regions of Mexico, highly organized, hyper-violent drug cartels have grown so immensely powerful and wealthy that they operate as literal shadow governments. They corrupt or assassinate local police and politicians, they exact their own illicit taxes from local businesses through extortion rackets, and they drive massive, horrific waves of violent crime. The state is fundamentally failing to protect its citizens from unauthorized violence.
So the average citizen looks at a constitution promising them a beautiful, prosperous life, and then they look out their window at cartel violence dominating their streets, and they completely lose faith in the regime's right to rule.
Exactly. The cognitive dissonance destroys legitimacy. And the central government is acutely aware of this crisis. They are desperately trying to shift their strategies to regain control and reestablish their authority. The text points out that in 2021, the Mexican government took significant legislative steps toward legalizing recreational marijuana.
Which seems like an odd priority if you're fighting a cartel war.
It is entirely strategic. The logic is to attack the massive black market profit margins of the cartels. The government is hoping that by legally regulating and taxing the drug trade, rather than purely fighting an unwinnable, highly destructive militarized war against it, they can reduce the financial power of the cartels, reduce the violence, and slowly reestablish the state's ultimate authority over its territory.
It's a desperate, calculated attempt to patch the operating system before the entire architecture crashes completely. Now, this brings us to what I think is the most unsettling, paradigm-shifting concept in the entire text. We in the West have this ingrained habit of inextricably linking the word democracy with the word freedom. We operate on the assumption that if people are given the right to vote in free elections, they will naturally, inevitably vote to protect civil liberties. But the political science data shows that those two concepts, democracy as a mechanical process and liberty as a philosophical value, are actually breaking apart in the modern world.
It is the great modern paradox of political science. We have to examine the rise of illiberal democracies. To understand why this is happening, we first have to rigorously define what contemporary liberal ideology actually entails. In the Western democratic tradition, liberalism means valuing political freedom, the mechanical right to vote in fair elections. But it inextricably pairs that with a whole suite of other equally important freedoms: economic freedom, the absolute right to freedom of speech, a free and unhindered press, religious liberty, and personal identity freedoms, such as LGBTQ rights. We have historically assumed they all come bundled together in one package.
Right. The assumption is that if a country has free elections, they will obviously protect free speech.
But the data is showing us that this assumption is flawed. We are increasingly seeing regimes across the globe where the citizens are using their political freedom, their power at the ballot box, to actively democratically strip away those liberal freedoms, usually targeting minority groups or political opposition. The people are democratically electing to be unfree.
I've been trying to wrap my head around this. It's like a group of people living in a house, and they take a fair democratic vote, and the majority decides to board up all the windows and lock all the doors from the inside. They are using the exact mechanism of democracy to systematically dismantle the freedoms we normally associate with a democracy.
That is a chilling but entirely accurate analogy. The mechanism is being used to kill the values.
Yeah.
Let's look closely at the specific case studies the text provides to see how this operates in reality. First, Hungary. Hungary is a representative parliamentary system that emerged as a democracy after the fall of the Soviet bloc. Currently, the Fidesz party, an ideologically conservative and fiercely nationalist party led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, holds a massive, commanding majority in the parliament.
And to be clear, they are very popular, right? They aren't rigging the voting machines. They keep winning these elections fairly.
They have immense, genuine popular support among the Hungarian electorate, but they have methodically used their democratically acquired parliamentary supermajority to systematically dismantle liberal institutions from the inside.
For example.
For example, they legislated the creation of a powerful national media authority. This state body has the power to levy massive, crippling financial fines on news outlets for coverage that the government deems unbalanced or offensive to public morals, effectively chilling the free press and forcing self-censorship. They also passed laws restricting officially recognized religious freedoms to just 14 specific traditional communities, stripping legal status from hundreds of others.
And they passed heavily restrictive laws targeting the LGBTQ community as well, didn't they?
Yes, very severe restrictions passed by Democratic majority. They amended the Constitution to effectively ban same-sex marriage. They banned adoption by LGBTQ individuals. And they passed a highly controversial law banning any promotion or positive educational portrayal of homosexuality or gender reassignment to minors. Furthermore, they used their parliamentary power to aggressively gerrymander electoral districts, redrawing the map to heavily favor the Fidesz party in all future elections. They are legally, democratically rewriting the rulebook to permanently entrench their own power and enforce a very specific, restrictive moral code on the entire nation.
And Hungary is right in the middle of the European Union. This isn't happening in some isolated corner of the world. What about outside of Europe?
The text points to India, which is famously the world's largest democracy by population. In 2014, Narendra Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, won a sweeping historic parliamentary majority. The BJP is anchored in an ideology of Hindu nationalism, essentially arguing that India is fundamentally and culturally a Hindu nation and that state policy should reflect that dominance.
But India is incredibly diverse. They have massive Muslim, Sikh, and Christian populations.
They do, and that is exactly where the severe friction lies. Using their massive democratic majorities, particularly in at least 8 state-level parliaments, the BJP has passed incredibly strict laws regulating religious conversion. On paper, the stated goal of these laws is to stop forced or coerced conversions. But in practice, the mechanics are deeply illiberal. If a citizen wants to change their religion, particularly if they are converting away from Hinduism to Islam or Christianity, they are legally required to notify the state. State officials or the police then investigate the individual to determine if the conversion is sincere and freely adopted.
Wait, the government gets to decide if your personal, internal, spiritual faith is sincere?
It's exactly. International human rights groups argue that this inherently and fundamentally violates basic religious liberty. It grants the state the intrusive authority to interrogate and potentially block your private spiritual choices. Yet these laws were debated, voted on, and passed by democratically elected representatives who were fulfilling the explicit desires of their nationalist voting base.
Let's look at one more example from the text to really cement this concept. Pakistan.
Pakistan is a very stark example. It was created in 1947 specifically to be a safe, democratic haven for Muslims on the Indian subcontinent. It has a representative parliament. Now, for decades, Pakistan had general blasphemy laws on the books that were remnants of British colonial rule, designed to protect all religious communities from intentional outrage. But in the 1980s, under pressure from religious factions, the democratically elected parliament massively expanded those laws.
They made them more specific to Islam.
Yes. They added highly specific prohibitions, making it a severe criminal offense, carrying life imprisonment or even the death penalty, to insult Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, or the Quran. And crucially, They significantly lowered the standard of evidence required to secure a conviction. Human rights organizations globally condemn these laws as massive, undeniable violations of free speech and religious liberty, noting that they are frequently weaponized to target religious minorities or to settle petty personal vendettas.
I'm struggling to accept this. So the citizens actually want these laws. They want the state to have the power to execute people for speech.
That is the incredibly uncomfortable truth that Western observers often struggle with. The text explicitly notes that these strict blasphemy laws remain highly popular among the broader Pakistani electorate. There is nothing in their constitution prohibiting the banning of blasphemous speech. It is a perfect, terrifying example of the majority democratically demanding an illiberal, restrictive policy. They want their in-group's values enforced on the outgroup, and they use the mechanism of democracy to achieve it.
So what does this all mean for the future of how the world is governed?
It forces us to confront a hard, paradigm-shifting reality we have, to conceptually divorce the mechanism of government, the existence of elections, parliaments, and voting from the values of a government, such as the protection of human rights, free speech, and equality. The source material concludes by explicitly questioning whether these highly popular yet deeply illiberal regimes will ever naturally evolve to align with Western human rights standards. The arc of history, it turns out, does not always naturally bend toward liberal freedom simply because people have the right to vote. Sometimes, when given the choice, the majority votes for control.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap this incredible, complex journey we've been on today. We started at the very bedrock, unpacking Max Weber's stark, unforgiving definition of a government holding the ultimate monopoly on rightful violence. We explored the delicate, constant dance between legally authorized power and the elusive psychological need for broad legitimacy, seeing how regimes use everything from the tax code on a pack of cigarettes to the emotional rhetoric of the bully pulpit to shape our behavior and manufacture our consent.
We examine the dark, dangerous side of that power, looking at how regimes utilize legal loopholes to suspend their own rules during states of emergency, sometimes leading to the paradox of constitutional dictatorships like Marcos. We saw what happens when the state fails entirely, leaving a vacuum for brutal shadow governments like the Taliban to establish order.
We mapped the incredibly diverse spectrum of authoritarian control, from the stifling manufactured media environments in Belarus to the divine isolationist mythology of North Korea. We navigated the quirky, often flawed mathematics of parliamentary systems where tiny fringe parties can hold national policy hostage, and the danger of constitutions like Mexico's, overpromising rights they simply cannot deliver. And finally, we confronted the modern paradox of illiberal democracies, where citizens willingly use the ballot box to board up the windows of their own liberty.
It is a complex, constantly shifting, often messy machinery that hums beneath the surface of every single society on Earth.
So the next time you drive down a paved road, or look at the taxes automatically deducted from your paycheck, or read a headline about a chaotic election in a foreign country, remember, you aren't just looking at random, disconnected events. You are looking directly at the gears of these massive governing regimes turning in real time, constantly negotiating their power, enforcing their authority, and desperately fighting for their legitimacy.
Every single law passed, every tax collected, and every emergency declaration issued is a live stress test of that operating system.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. We've learned today that a regime's legitimacy ultimately rests on its ability to provide tangible order, stability, and results for its people. Looking to the future, as the world faces massive, unprecedented, borderless crises, things like accelerating climate change, resource scarcity, or future, even more severe pandemics, what happens if a streamlined authoritarian regime proves it can mobilize and solve these existential problems faster and more efficiently than a messy, slow-moving, deeply divided democracy? If legitimacy is ultimately based on survival and results, will the citizens of tomorrow, facing catastrophic threats, willingly vote to trade their representative freedoms for authoritarian security? Will we use the ballot box to hand over the keys? Something to think about the next time you encounter a new rule or restriction. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Usually when we talk about governments or regimes, there's this expectation of permanence.
Oh, totally.
Right. Like we tend to view nations almost like engineering projects. You build a bridge, and barring an earthquake, it just stands there.
Yeah, you assume the concrete is solid.
Exactly. You draw a border, you raise a flag, write a constitution, and you just assume the system holding it all together is, solid bedrock.
Right.
And for most of our lives, we treat the geopolitical map as something totally binary. I mean, a country is either a democracy or it's a dictatorship. It's clean, it's categorized.
It's comforting, too, I think.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because human beings just crave clear definitions, especially, when it comes to power. We want to know exactly who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and exactly how the machine operates.
Right. But then, you look at the actual lived reality of global politics, and suddenly that neat little categorization completely falls apart.
It completely shatters.
It does. You step past the headlines, and you realize we are dealing with a landscape of government that is incredibly murky. It's fluid. And the transition from freedom to authoritarianism isn't always marked by, like, tanks rolling down the street.
No, not at all.
Sometimes it happens entirely through spreadsheets or, corporate boardrooms and subtly reworded election laws.
Yeah, that is the absolute definition of political muddy waters. It's never as simple as just checking to see if a country holds an election.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. Welcome to the show. We are jumping into this extraordinarily complex, frankly kind of terrifying and deeply fascinating spectrum of global regimes.
It really is a fascinating topic.
It is. And our mission today is to give you, the listener, a shortcut to being deeply well-informed about how different countries are actually run behind the scenes. We're cutting through all the dense political jargon to understand why some democracies completely fail while others thrive, and what really practically separates a dictator from a president.
I love that. And to do that, we really need to start with a very specific kind of visceral example.
Yeah, let's look at Hong Kong.
It is the perfect microcosm for this entire conversation.
It really is. So picture the scene, right? It's July 1st, 1997. Rain is just pouring down in Hong Kong. Prince Charles is there. The British flag comes down. The Chinese flag goes up.
A huge historic moment.
Massive. The British had held Hong Kong as a colony going all the way back to 1842, right after the First Opium War. But the handover came with a very specific, legally binding international treaty.
Right, the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
Exactly. Hong Kong was designated as a special administrative region, and the promise, which was broadcast to the entire world, was 50 years of internal self-governance.
50 years.
Yeah, a half-century to maintain their own capitalist system, their own independent judiciary, their own way of life. The slogan was literally, one country, two systems.
And I mean, on paper, that sounds like a brilliant compromise, right?
Yeah, it does.
It allowed Beijing to reclaim sovereignty while giving the citizens of Hong Kong and, crucially, the international business community a guarantee of stability.
Right.
But the reality of actually implementing two systems under one authoritarian umbrella is, well, it's entirely different.
Yeah, because Beijing was terrified. I mean, they weren't just taking back a port city. They were absorbing a population that had grown accustomed to certain freedoms.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, ironically, the British had never fully implemented a robust democracy in Hong Kong either, largely because Beijing had spent decades warning them not to.
Right, they threatened them.
They did. But the culture of free speech was there. The culture of protest was there. And Beijing, methodically, year by year, began to choke it off. They were just terrified that if full democratic elections were allowed in Hong Kong, that contagion would spread to the mainland.
And this is where we have to really look at the mechanisms of control, because you mentioned earlier, it doesn't always look like tanks. Beijing didn't just march the People's Liberation Army into the streets right away to shut down democratic thought. They used economics as a weapon.
Yeah, which is so modern.
It's incredibly modern. They went to the massive conglomerates operating in Hong Kong. They warned local media outlets. The message was implicit, but just devastating. Basically, if your newspaper or your airline or your bank backs the democracy movement, you will lose access to the mainland market.
Wow. So they literally squeezed the advertising revenue.
Exactly. You saw major corporations suddenly pulling advertisements from pro-democracy newspapers, entirely starving them of funding.
Yeah.
You saw airline executives forced out just because their employees participated in protests.
It's just wild.
It is a highly sophisticated, very modern way of exerting control. It basically weaponizes the free market against free speech.
But the people of Hong Kong, they didn't just accept it silently, right?
No, not at all.
Hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers took to the streets, most famously during the Umbrella Movement and those massive protests of 2014 and 2019.
Right.
They used social media, encrypted messaging, and just sheer physical endurance to demand open candidate nominations for their elections. They recognized the trap.
Oh, they saw right through it.
Yeah, Beijing was essentially saying, sure, you can have an election and you can vote for whoever you want as long as you choose from this pre-approved list of candidates handpicked by a pro-Beijing committee.
Which obviously is no choice at all.
Right.
And the reason this anecdote is so vital to our understanding of regimes, I think, is that it captures a fundamental truth. Democracy is profoundly contentious, and it is highly contagious.
Contagious, I like that word for it.
Yeah, it is not a natural state of being that just exists once you declare it. It requires constant active maintenance. I mean, from the very birth of the American Republic, the founders were looking over their shoulders at the ruins of Athenian and Roman democracies, terrified that their new experiment would collapse in the exact same way.
Right. The dividing line between dictatorship and democracy isn't a wall. It's a vast, slippery slope. And to navigate that slope, we really need a framework. Globally, we can look at 4 main categories of regimes.
Okay, let's break them down.
Yeah, so you have democratic regimes like what you see in the US, Canada, or Western Europe. You have transitional regimes, which are places in a state of flux or backsliding, like Egypt or Russia.
Right.
Then you move into authoritarian regimes like Iran or China. And finally, the absolute extreme end, totalitarian regimes like North Korea.
But the lines between these blur constantly.
Always. A country can have a beautifully written constitution, it can have multiple political parties, it can hold regular elections, and still be profoundly undemocratic.
Which is why we have to start by completely dismantling a very persistent myth.
Okay, lay it on me.
If we want to understand what a democratic regime actually is, we have to let go of the romanticized ideal of direct democracy.
Right, because when we hear the word democracy, we instantly think of the Greeks, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
The word itself is Greek. Demos, meaning people, and kratia, meaning rule, power to the people. But the Greek model, that Athenian model of pure direct democracy, is fundamentally flawed when you try to apply it to the modern world. It just doesn't scale.
It doesn't scale at all. In ancient Athens, the General Assembly was the ultimate authority. You had thousands of citizens physically gathering on a hill called the Phoenix.
Just hanging out on a hill.
Yeah, just hanging out, debating. Any citizen could stand up, speak, and propose a law. They voted directly on matters of war, finance, and justice.
Right.
But we really have to look at the mechanics of that. First off, citizens excluded women, slaves, and foreigners, meaning the actual voting body was a tiny fraction of the population.
So not quite as pure as it sounds.
No, not at all. But more importantly, it only worked because of the incredibly small geographic and demographic scale of a city-state.
Right. Imagine trying to scale that up. Imagine trying to get 300 million people into a room to debate the granular details of, like, a federal highway spending bill.
Oh, it would be a nightmare.
Or the complex chemical regulations of a new pharmaceutical drug. You just can't. There's this fantastic quote from a 17th century Englishman named John Selden.
I love this quote.
Yeah, he was arguing for a representative parliament in London, and he just plainly stated the logistical truth. He said, "The room will not hold all."
It's a physical impossibility. But it's not just about physical space, right? It's about cognitive load
Right.
and the sheer velocity of modern governance. A national government that submitted every single decision to millions of voters wouldn't just be slow, it would be entirely paralyzed. The state would grind to a complete halt.
Now wait, let me push back on this a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Because when I think of direct democracy in the modern era, I don't really think of everyone gathering on a hill. I think of referendums.
Referendums.
We see these all the time, especially in places like California or, Switzerland. Citizens vote directly on a specific law, bypassing the legislature entirely. Isn't that direct democracy functioning right now?
It is a limited application of direct democracy, yes. But if you look closely at how referendums actually function in practice, they come with massive, glaring caveats.
Like what?
Well, on the surface, a referendum seems like the purest expression of the people's will, the ultimate democratic tool. But they are incredibly susceptible to manipulation, both by special interests and, honestly, by autocratic leaders.
So the analogy that comes to mind here is that running a country via referendum is a bit like asking the passengers to fly a commercial airliner.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like, yes, we all want to get to our destination safely. We all share the same broad goal. But do the passengers understand the complex aerodynamics, the fuel management systems, and the air traffic control protocols well enough to make the minute-by-minute decisions required to keep the plane in the air?
Exactly. The complexity of modern policy is just staggering. Look at your example of California. Voters there routinely face ballots packed with scores of complex propositions.
Oh, it's exhausting just reading them.
Right. Some of these measures are hundreds of pages of dense legal text. So what happens? You get well-funded interest groups spending millions of dollars on emotional, often really misleading television ads to sway the public.
Yeah, the commercials are everywhere.
And frequently, the wording on the ballot is deliberately designed to confuse you. You'll have voters passing one measure to massively increase funding for schools, and then simultaneously passing another measure to drastically cut the property taxes that fund those very schools.
Right, because the public isn't forced to balance the budget. They can vote for all the services and none of the taxes, leaving the representative government completely paralyzed trying to square the circle.
Exactly.
But it gets a lot darker than just confused voters, because dictators, they absolutely love referendums.
Oh, they use them all the time. Autocratic leaders use referendums specifically to bypass the checks and balances of conventional politicians and consolidate their own power.
Give me an example of that.
Well, French President Charles de Gaulle was a master of this in the 1960s. Yeah, whenever he faced opposition in the legislature, he would just draft a referendum, phrase it in a way that essentially asked, do you love France and want me to save it?
Yeah.
And then use the resulting yes vote to rewrite the rules.
Wow. And you see this in more blatant dictatorships, too. Like in Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf seized power in a military coup in 1999.
Right.
And a few years later, in 2002, he wanted to legitimize his rule. Did he hold a fair election with opposition candidates? No. He held a nationwide referendum asking the public to confirm him in office for 5 more years.
And unsurprisingly, he won with an overwhelming, statistically absurd majority.
Naturally.
It's a way of putting a democratic veneer over a raw power grab. It allows the autocrat to point to the ballot box and say, look, the people chose me.
Which perfectly transitions us into the concept of the illiberal democracy.
Yes, this is so important.
I feel like this is probably the most dangerous trap in modern geopolitics. And it's essential for you, the listener, to understand this when watching the news today. You see an election happening on television. You see citizens lining up, putting pieces of paper into a ballot box. The international monitors might even say the vote counting was relatively accurate.
Right.
You look at that and think, okay, democracy is functioning.
But that is a complete illusion if the institutions surrounding that ballot box are compromised. An illiberal democracy is a regime where elections take place, sure, but the regime that gets elected immediately proceeds to use that electoral mandate to ride roughshod over human and civil rights.
Wow.
They systematically dismantle the actual protections of a free society.
Like, you voted for me, so now I have absolute authority to silence anyone who didn't.
Exactly.
And we've seen this play out in places like Egypt and Turkey. A leader wins a legitimate election and then slowly starts jailing journalists, purging independent judges from the courts, and altering the Constitution to ensure they can never legally be removed from power.
Yeah, it's slow burn.
To help quantify this incredibly messy reality, political scientists rely heavily on tools like the Freedom House scale.
And the Freedom House methodology is fascinating because it doesn't just look at whether an election occurred. It deeply evaluates political rights and civil liberties. It ranks countries annually on a scale of 1 to 7.
Okay, 1 to 7.
Right. A score of 1 means a country is completely free. A score of 7 means it is completely not free.
To give some context to that, countries like the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe generally sit at a 1.
Yeah, they're free.
They're categorized as free. But then you look at a country like Mexico, which often sits around a 3. It's categorized as partly free.
Which makes sense.
Right. They have competitive elections, but they also have massive issues with corruption, cartel violence, intimidating voters and candidates, and a justice system that really struggles with impunity.
And then you slide further down the scale to a country like Russia, which sits at a 6.
Yeah.
Solidly not free. They hold elections, yes, but opposition candidates are poisoned, imprisoned, or barred from running, and the media is entirely state-controlled. And at the absolute bottom, you have North Korea at a 7. No elections, no rights, total state control.
And the scary part is that countries move on this scale all the time. Democracy is not a permanent achievement. It is a fragile ecosystem that has to be actively maintained.
Exactly.
Which begs the question, if direct democracy is a logistical nightmare and illiberal democracy is an authoritarian trap, what actually works? We rely on representative democracy. But for a representative democracy to be legitimate, stable, and truly free, it requires a deeply complex balance of specific features. You can't just write, "We are a democracy" on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It has to be built pillar by pillar.
Exactly right. And political scientists generally agree on 7 distinct structural pillars that must be present and functioning for a society to be considered a true representative democracy.
7 pillars.
Yeah, and if you pull one of these pillars away, the whole structure starts to sag.
Let's walk through these because this is really the actual mechanical engine of a free society.
Sounds good.
The first 2 pillars are deeply intertwined, right? Popular accountability and political competition. On a fundamental level, the leaders in charge must genuinely fear being voted out of office. If they perform poorly, if they govern corruptly, the public must have the power to fire them.
Right.
But for that accountability to exist, the voters must have a real, viable choice.
Exactly. If there's no consequence for bad governance, there's no accountability. And that choice has to be legitimate. We see authoritarian regimes holding elections where there is only one candidate on the ballot, or where the opposition parties are actually just state-funded puppets designed to lose.
Yeah, that's just fake competition.
Totally fake. A true democracy requires a minimum of 2 distinct, viable alternatives.
But let me pause here, because this is where the mirror really gets turned back on established democracies. And just to be clear, we are neutrally reporting the structural critique here, not taking sides. We often think of the United States as the gold standard for political competition. You have 2 massive parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, constantly battling for power. But when you look at the mechanics, the reality is far more compromised.
It is a significant structural flaw. In theory, Americans have a choice. In practice, the system heavily insulates incumbents from true competition.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the sheer astronomical cost of running a modern political campaign in the U.S. dissuades incredibly capable grassroots challengers from even entering the race. If you don't have access to millions of dollars in fundraising, you just aren't viable.
And then you have the dark art of gerrymandering.
Oh, gerrymandering, yes.
This is where state legislatures, whichever party happens to be in power, physically redraw the district boundary lines to virtually guarantee that their party's incumbents get reelected. They pack all the opposing voters into one single district to minimize their overall voice, and they crack other communities apart to dilute their voting power.
It's incredibly effective.
It is. The result is that in the U.S. House of Representatives, the vast majority of seats are completely uncompetitive. The election is essentially decided during the primary among the most extreme voters.
So while the U.S. absolutely meets the criteria for competition on paper, the quality of that political competition is severely diluted in everyday practice. It's a vital reminder that even a deeply established democracy has undemocratic elements embedded within its structure.
Which brings us to the third pillar, and honestly, this is the ultimate stress test for any regime: alternation in power.
Yes.
Specifically, what the famous Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington called the 2-turnover test.
This is one of the most brilliant, pragmatic metrics in political science. The core idea is that the reins of power must occasionally change hands. The ins must become the outs, and they must do so peacefully and legitimately.
Right.
If a single ruling party stays in power for decades on end, even if they constantly claim it's just because they are incredibly popular and competent, it is highly likely they are quietly tilting the rules of the game to ensure they never lose.
Yeah, look at Singapore. Singapore is economically brilliant, safe, modern, but the ruling People's Action Party has won every single election since independence.
Right.
They do this through incredibly strict controls on free speech, keeping the official campaign period incredibly short, sometimes just a week or two, and utilizing complex electoral systems like group representation constituencies, which make it nearly impossible for opposition parties to field enough candidates.
It's a stacked deck.
Totally. Or look at Mexico's history. For 70 years, the PRI party ran Mexico. A Peruvian writer famously called it the perfect dictatorship. Because they held regular elections, they never canceled the Constitution. But the PRI won every single presidency and governorship for decades.
Wow.
They used massive patronage networks, clientelism, and occasional outright fraud to ensure the opposition never truly had a chance, right up until the year 2000, when Vicente Fox from the PAN party finally broke the streak.
And that 2000 election in Mexico is exactly the moment Huntington's test is looking for. But Huntington actually goes a step further.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The 2-turnover test argues that a new transitional democracy is only firmly structurally rooted after 2 peaceful electoral alternations of government.
Why 2?
Because the first turnover shows that an entrenched regime can be voted out. But the second turnover is the real test of institutional strength. It shows that the new regime, the people who just won the power, are also willing to step down peacefully when they inevitably lose down the road.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, they don't try to pull the ladder up behind them once they're in.
It's proof that the system itself is more important to the politicians than their own personal power. Poland is a textbook example of passing this test.
Poland is a great example.
In 1989, they miraculously and peacefully overthrow the communist regime. They vote in the Solidarity Coalition, the heroes of the revolution. But governing is hard. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
A few years later, the economy is struggling through shock therapy, and the voters are angry. So what happens? They vote the Solidarity heroes out, and they vote in a coalition of former socialists.
Right.
And then a few years after that, they vote the socialists out and bring in a right-of-center government. They proved over and over that the ballot box was supreme.
Contrast that, compare that to Russia. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin oversaw the transition. But power never truly alternated through an election.
No, it didn't.
Yeltsin handpicked Vladimir Putin as his successor, who then built an authoritarian apparatus that ensured true opposition could never mount a successful challenge. Russia has never passed the two-turnover test. The system is designed to prevent it.
That perfectly sets up the fourth pillar, uncertain electoral outcomes. I love thinking about this in terms of physics. An election should never be as predictable as gravity.
I love that analogy.
Right. If you know exactly how an election is going to go before a single ballot is printed, you have a massive systemic problem.
Yes. For democracy to function, voting must not be entirely determined by static demographic groups.
Okay, elaborate on that.
If 100% of a specific tribe, or a specific religious sect, or a rigid social class automatically votes for a given candidate every single time, the country gets locked into perpetual bitterness. The political process ceases to be a debate about persuasion, policy, and the future. It devolves into a mere census.
Wow, a census.
Yeah, you were just counting who has the larger demographic block,
Yeah.
and the minority knows they will never, ever have a voice.
And we see the catastrophic results of this in deeply divided societies. Like in post-invasion Iraq, voting closely followed religious and ethnic lines. The Shias voted for Shia parties, the Sunnis voted for Sunni parties, the Kurds voted for Kurdish parties. Because the Shias were the demographic majority, they dominated the government and largely ignored the Sunni minority.
Exactly.
That predictability, that lack of any fluid swing voters, directly invited uprising and sectarian violence. It made governance essentially impossible.
Or look at Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Mugabe belonged to the majority Shona tribe. For decades, the Shona largely block voted for him, allowing him to act with absolute brutal impunity against the minority Ndebele tribe.
There was a famous, slightly cynical joke regarding Indian politics that captures this perfectly. Have you heard it?
Let me hear it.
It goes, you don't cast your vote, you vote your caste. Right. People vote according to their deeply ingrained social stratification. But the saving grace in India, the reason it remains a functioning democracy despite its immense complexity, is that Indian individualism and economic interests are often strong enough to override those caste lines.
Right, this crossover.
Exactly. You have poor members of high castes, rich members of low castes, and millions of swing voters. That keeps the politicians terrified. They have to actually campaign on building roads and schools rather than just relying on demographic loyalty. You need a significant percentage of the electorate to be, up for grabs.
Exactly. Let's move to the fifth and sixth pillars, which must be viewed together. Popular representation and majority decision, but fundamentally constrained by minority rights.
Okay.
This tackles the core philosophical question of what an elected official is actually hired to do. When you send someone to the Capitol, are they a mandate or are they a trustee?
Oh, this is a classic centuries-old debate. If you subscribe to the mandate theory of representation, you believe your elected official is essentially a highly paid messenger.
Right, they just do what you say.
They should simply carry out the specific, explicit, polled wishes of the public. If 60% of the public wants a new highway, the representative votes for the highway, regardless of whether they personally think it's an environmental disaster or mathematically unfundable. They are just a vessel for the voters' immediate will.
But the famous economist and political scientist Joseph Schumpeter tore this theory apart. He pointed out a glaring flaw in the mandate theory. It relies on the deeply flawed assumption that the people actually hold a definite, rational, well-researched opinion on every single complex question of statecraft.
Which they absolutely don't. We barely have time to manage our own lives, let alone deeply research the intricacies of nuclear nonproliferation treaties, or the specific chemical thresholds for nitrous oxide emissions, or the deep mechanics of international banking liquidity.
Right, nobody has time for that. And that is precisely where the trustee model becomes essential. A representative acts as a trustee when they make decisions based on what they genuinely believe is in the long-term best interest of the nation as a whole, even if it violently contradicts the immediate, reactive, emotional wishes of their own constituents.
And the ultimate, most dramatic modern example of this is the 2008 and 2009 U.S. financial bailouts.
Oh, yeah. Perfect example.
I want to linger on this because it perfectly illustrates the agony of the trustee model. And again, just objectively reporting the historical dynamics here. It's late 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses. The global financial system is literally hours away from seizing up entirely.
It was terrifying.
ATMs might stop dispensing cash. Payrolls won't be met. We are staring into the abyss of a second Great Depression.
So the Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve go to Congress and say, we need hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out the very banks whose reckless, greedy behavior caused this entire crisis.
And the public was furious. The polling was off the charts. The average voter was screaming, absolutely not. Let the bankers burn. Do not give them our tax dollars.
Yeah, the anger was real.
If Congress had acted purely on the mandate theory, they would have voted no, and the global economy likely would have cratered.
But legislators, looking at the classified economic briefings, looking at the very real possibility of total systemic collapse, had to swallow hard. They had to abandon the mandate theory, face the wrath of their voters, and vote for the bailouts anyway.
They took the hit.
They did. They acted as trustees for the long-term survival of the public, even when the public passionately hated them for it in the short term.
It perfectly captures what the political scientist E. Schachtschneider said about democracy. He said the beginning of wisdom is distinguishing between what the people can do and what they cannot do.
That's profound.
The public can and should dictate the general direction of the country. They can decide between a conservative or liberal vision. But they cannot manage the minute, highly technical details of governance by sheer weight of numbers.
And critically, while the majority decides that general direction, there must be an ironclad constitutional respect for minority rights.
Right.
This is usually guarded by an independent, non-political judiciary.
Right.
If 51% of the population votes to strip the property rights or the voting rights or the religious freedom of the other 49%, you do not have a democracy. You have a tyranny of the majority. A democracy is defined just as much by what the majority is forbidden to do as what it is allowed to do.
Which flows perfectly into the seventh and final pillar, the right of dissent and a free press. Let's say the majority does pass an unjust law. Let's say the system fails. The citizens must retain the fundamental right to resist. You can trace this philosophical thread of civil disobedience straight back to Henry David Thoreau.
Oh, yeah.
In 1846, Thoreau famously spent a night in jail because he point-blank refused to pay his poll tax. Why? Because he knew his tax dollars were funding the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery, which he viewed as deeply immoral.
And that concept was adopted and perfected by giants like Mahatma Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States.
Absolutely.
What is vital to understand about their form of disobedience is that it was intentionally civil. It was explicitly nonviolent. It wasn't about trying to overthrow the government by force. It was a highly strategic attention-getting mechanism.
Right. If you read MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, the strategy is brilliantly clear. You deliberately break an unjust, racist local law, like sitting at a segregated lunch counter. You allow yourself to be arrested peacefully. Why? Because that creates a crisis.
It forces the issue.
It forces the authorities to enforce their bigotry in the light of day. It generates legal cases that can be appealed up to the federal courts to get the law struck down. And it forces the complacent majority of the country to watch the brutality on the evening news and experience a moral reckoning.
And this is the crux of the matter, none of that works without a free press.
So true.
The civil rights movement relied heavily on television cameras broadcasting the reality of segregation to living rooms across the nation. This is why a free press is often referred to as the fourth branch of government. The absolute quickest, most reliable way to check the democratic health of a regime is to ask one simple question. Can a journalist publish a deeply researched, highly critical article about the leader of the country without fear of being arrested, exiled, or murdered?
Dictatorships simply cannot tolerate a critical press. The control of information is the control of reality. You see this vividly in authoritarian systems like China. They understand that a free flow of information is an existential threat to their monopoly on power. They built the Great Firewall not just to block foreign websites, but to systematically monitor and scrub domestic social media.
Yeah, the surveillance is massive.
If a scandal breaks, or if there is a hint of organized protest, they don't just send in the police. They use algorithms to delete keywords, they shut down millions of blogs overnight, and they quietly disappear. The journalists, the lawyers, and the doctors who dare to speak up. They engineer a society where dissent functionally does not exist in the public sphere.
So we have our 7 pillars: accountability, competition, peaceful turnover, unpredictable outcomes, a balance of mandate and trusteeship, minority rights, and the freedom to dissent.
But here is the uncomfortable truth that political scientists grapple with. Even if a country has beautifully constructed all 7 of those pillars, power is never ever distributed equally.
No, never.
Some people, some groups, always have more influence, more money, and more access, which leads to a deeply cynical but necessary question. In a democracy, who actually rules?
This brings us to section 3 of our journey, and one of the most intense, long-running debates in sociology and political science: the clash between the elite theorists and the pluralists.
I think a lot of people listening are going to find the elite theorists incredibly relatable.
Oh, I'm sure they will.
It maps onto the cynical feeling many of us have when we watch the news. The core argument of elite theory is that no matter how noble your democratic intentions are, no matter how many elections you hold, actual governing power inevitably always falls into the hands of a tiny, unaccountable few.
We can start with Gaetano Mosca, a brilliant Italian political scientist. Late in the 19th century, Mosca argued that if you look at any society across human history, ancient, medieval, or modern, it always mathematically splits into 2 groups: a class that rules and a class that is ruled.
Interesting.
The ruling class is always a tiny minority, but because they are small, they are highly organized, they monopolize power, they control the wealth, and they enjoy all the perks. The masses, the majority, are disorganized, fractured, and ultimately directed and controlled by the elite.
And then another sociologist, Robert Michaels, took this idea and codified it into what he called the iron law of oligarchy. This was fascinating to me. Michaels argued that even if you start a fiercely democratic grassroots organization, say a labor union or a progressive political party where everyone has an equal vote over time, it will inevitably transform into an oligarchy run by a few elites.
Why does that happen?
Good question.
Because of the mechanics of organization. To be effective, an organization needs leaders. It needs full-time bureaucrats. It needs experts who understand the complex rules. Eventually, those leaders gain specialized knowledge that the average rank-and-file member doesn't have. They control the communication channels. They control the treasury. Over time, they become entrenched. They protect their own positions, and the democratic grassroots lose control of their own creation.
Wow. But the most famous modern proponent of this was C. Wright Mills, an American sociologist who wrote a seminal book in the 1950s called The Power Elite. Mills wasn't looking at ancient Rome. He was looking squarely at the United States. And he painted a picture of a massive, interlocking conspiracy at the very top of American society.
Mills argued that American democracy was a facade masking a triad of power. You have the corporate chieftains running big business, you have the political leaders in the executive branch, and you have the top-ranking generals in the military. Mills observed that these people all know each other.
They run into the same circles.
Exactly. They move seamlessly between these 3 spheres. A general retires and joins the board of a defense contractor. A corporate CEO becomes the Secretary of Defense. They go to the same elite universities. They belong to the same country clubs.
And their interests perfectly align. The corporations fund the politicians' campaigns. The politicians vote for massive defense budgets. The generals award those lucrative multi-billion-dollar defense contracts back to the corporations. It's a closed, self-sustaining loop. Mills warned that this military-industrial complex would constantly drive the United States toward a state of permanent war economy because peace isn't profitable for the elite.
And you can look at modern American politics and find an abundance of evidence that seems to perfectly validate the elite theorists.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the presidency. In the 2004 election, the entire country, over 100 million voters, supposedly had a profound choice between 2 drastically different visions for the country, George W. Bush or John Kerry. Yet both of those men were multimillionaires, both attended Yale University, and remarkably, both were tapped to join the exact same ultra-secretive society, Skull and Bones. In 2012, you had Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Very different platforms, but both held degrees from Harvard Law School. You look at the U.S. Congress, and well over half of the members are millionaires, dictating economic policy for a public that largely lives paycheck to paycheck.
It's quite a
And
contrast.
then you throw in the modern era of super PACs, where a single billionaire can legally dump $50 million into a political race to buy television ads and shape the narrative, usually in exchange for tax loopholes.
The pure elite theorist looks at all of this evidence and concludes that society is simply a single steep pyramid. At the very top sits a tiny, coordinated, unaccountable elite who pull all the levers of power, and the elections at the bottom are just theater to keep the masses pacified.
It is a dark, compelling argument. But wait, we cannot stop there, because there is a massive, robust rebuttal to this worldview, championed by scholars like Robert Dahl. This is the pluralist school of thought. The pluralists look at the elite theory and say, you guys are watching too many conspiracy movies. It is way too simplistic.
Right. Pluralists argue that if you actually study how a specific bill becomes a law, the elite theory falls apart. If a single, coordinated cabal of billionaires truly ran everything, they would win every single time. But they don't. Pluralists argue that politics is not driven by one monolithic elite, but by a chaotic, overlapping web of competing interest groups.
The idea is that in a free society, just about any group of citizens can organize to demand something. You have labor unions, environmental groups, the gun lobbies, civil rights organizations, agricultural coalitions, and politicians ultimately are self-interested actors who want to get reelected. They need votes. So they're forced to listen to these organized groups.
And let's dive deeply into a specific, fascinating example that perfectly illustrates the pluralist argument. Let's look at U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. If you subscribe strictly to elite theory, who are the most powerful elites in the American economy? The massive multinational oil companies. ExxonMobil, Chevron, they possess unfathomable wealth and geopolitical influence.
Okay, I'm following you.
And strategically, financially, those oil companies are deeply incentivized to maintain excellent relations with the Arab states, where the vast majority of the world's oil reserves are located. Therefore, if the elite theory is correct and billionaires hold a hammerlock on the system, U.S. foreign policy should be dictated by big oil. American policy should heavily favor Arab nations and largely abandon or minimize its alliance with Israel.
Logically, yes. That is what elite theory predicts. But look at reality. The United States has historically maintained an incredibly staunch, unwavering geopolitical and military alliance with Israel, often to the intense frustration of Arab oil-producing nations. Why? How did big oil lose that fight?
Because of pluralism. Because American Jews, while a small percentage of the population, are highly politically engaged. They organize, they donate, and crucially, they vote in high numbers. And they're joined by millions of fundamentalist Christians who also passionately support Israel for theological reasons.
Ah, I see.
They form massive lobbying groups like AIPAC, politicians look at the math. Big oil has money, but they don't have millions of highly motivated voters threatening to unseat them in the next primary. The pro-Israel interest groups do.
And again, we're just looking at the mechanics of this, not endorsing a political stance. Pluralists point to this and say, look, the billionaires do not dictate everything. The system actually works through these competing groups, pulling the government in different directions. Sometimes business wins, sometimes labor wins, sometimes environmentalists win. I love the visual metaphors for this debate. The pure elite theorist sees society as a single, rigid pyramid. The pure pluralist sees society more like a giant pool table. You have tons of random billiard balls representing all these different interest groups, just constantly colliding with each other, bouncing off the bumpers and striking the 8-ball of government to produce a policy. It's chaotic, but it's democratic.
So who is right, the pyramid or the pool table? As is almost always the case in political science, the reality is a synthesis of the two. The most accurate model is what political scientist Robert Dahl called polyarchy, or what Aaron Lidgefart termed consociational democracy.
Let's unpack that, because I think this is the most accurate description of how modern democracies actually function. It's not one giant pyramid, and it's not random billiard balls. It is a landscape filled with small pyramids.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Society is divided into different sectors. You have the corporate sector, the labor sector, the agricultural sector, the military, different religious groups, different ethnic groups. Each of these groups does have its own elite at the top of its own small pyramid. Labor unions have union bosses. Environmental groups have highly paid executive directors.
So the iron law of oligarchy is true within the groups themselves.
Precisely. But what makes a democracy stable, what prevents it from collapsing into violence, is when the elites at the top of these various small pyramids recognize that they have to share the country. They strike bargains with each other. They agree to manage conflict through the constitutional rules of the game. They compromise.
The classic textbook example of this working beautifully is the Netherlands in the mid-20th century. The Dutch society was deeply fractured into what they called pillars or verzuiling. You had a strict Catholic pillar, a strict Calvinist Protestant pillar, and a secular socialist pillar.
And these groups lived entirely separate lives. If you were a Dutch Catholic in 1950, you went to a Catholic school, joined a Catholic labor union, read the Catholic newspaper, listened to the Catholic radio station, and voted for the Catholic political party. You rarely interacted with Calvinists. Society was completely segregated by ideology.
Which sounds like a recipe for a civil war. But it didn't happen. Why? Because the elites, the leaders of the Catholic, Calvinist, and socialist pyramids met at the top. They recognized that no single group had a pure majority. So they compromised. They created a system of proportional representation and massive subsidies where every group got funding for their own schools and hospitals. They agreed on the rules. Everyone got a piece of the pie. No one got the whole pie. And the system was incredibly peaceful and stable.
But the dark side of this theory is what happens when that elite consensus breaks down. What happens when the leaders of the pyramids refuse to compromise, or when they actively decide to demonize each other to rile up their base? The result is catastrophic.
You look at Lebanon in the 1970s. For a long time, the Christian and Muslim elites struck a delicate balance of power. The demographic changes and external pressures shattered that consensus, and the elites stopped compromising. The result was a horrific 15-year civil war.
Awful.
Or look at the United States in the 1850s. The northern industrial elites and the southern planter elites had compromised for decades over the issue of slavery. But when that moral and economic compromise finally broke down, the elites went to war, resulting in 600,000 dead. When elites fail to compromise, the entire society bleeds.
And that grim reality leads us directly into the darkest territory of our discussion. We've seen how democracies, however flawed, attempt to manage power by balancing these competing elites. But what happens when one group, one elite faction, decides they don't want to compromise anymore? What happens when they decide to completely ruthlessly eliminate all competition and control every single aspect of human existence?
We leave authoritarianism behind, and we enter the very dark, terrifying realm of totalitarianism.
And it is vital to establish right away that totalitarianism is a uniquely modern phenomenon. It is fundamentally a disease of the 20th century.
Now, I have to admit, when I first encountered that idea, I pushed back on it. I thought, wait a minute, weren't ancient kings and emperors totalitarian?
Yeah.
If you look at Ivan the Terrible in Russia or Genghis Khan or the pharaohs of Egypt, I mean, they had absolute life and death power over their subjects. They were dictators. How is that not totalitarian?
They were autocrats, absolutely. They were despots, tyrants, absolute monarchs. You look at King Louis XIV of France, who famously declared, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state." He wielded immense power. If you wanted you executed, you were executed. But those ancient and medieval rulers lacked the one crucial defining ingredient required for totalitarianism: modern technology.
This is such a profound distinction.
Yeah.
Let's really look at the mechanics of living under an autocrat in the 1700s.
Yeah.
The king might desire total control over your thoughts, but he simply doesn't have the physical bandwidth to achieve it.
Right, he can't.
He doesn't have the telegraph, he doesn't have a national rail network, he doesn't have mass-printed newspapers, and he certainly doesn't have microphones to put in your living room.
Exactly. The logistics of empire meant that power was projected weakly over long distances. The king mainly wanted two things from the average peasant: pay your taxes, and don't launch an armed rebellion. If you did those two things, the state largely left you alone. Average citizens lived their private lives, raised their families, and practiced their local customs largely untouched by the crown's daily micromanagement.
Totalitarianism is an entirely different beast. It requires modern communication and transportation technology because it attempts the total restructuring of society. It isn't satisfied with mere obedience. It wants to remold the human soul. It wants to obliterate the line between public and private life entirely. It insists not just that you obey the dictator, but that you actively, enthusiastically worship the dictator.
To understand the anatomy of this nightmare, political scientists Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski identified 6 specific interlocking features that define a totalitarian regime. Let's walk through these because it paints a chilling, mechanical picture of how these systems destroy human freedom.
Feature number 1, an all-encompassing ideology. This is not just a standard political platform like lower taxes or more healthcare. This is a quasi-religious, totalizing theory of human history, economics, and future social development.
It's an ideology that claims to possess the absolute scientific truth of human destiny. It paints the world entirely in black and white. It promises that if society just follows the plan, no matter how much suffering is required in the short term, they will achieve a perfect, conflict-free utopia.
A dangerous promise.
Very. And because they claim to be building paradise, the stakes are infinite. Which means anyone who opposes the state or even questions the state isn't just a political opponent with a different opinion. They are an evil enemy of the people actively trying to destroy paradise. In the Soviet Union, deep, mandatory study of Marxist-Leninist thought was required from kindergarten through university. Your ideological purity was more important than your actual competence.
Which brings us to feature number 2, a single party. One single political entity completely dominates the apparatus of the state. This party is almost always led by a single dictator who cultivates a literal cult of personality. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Benito Mussolini. They didn't just want to be respected as leaders, they demanded to be worshipped as infallible demigods. Their faces were on every building, their words broadcast constantly.
And crucially, the party itself is exclusive. It is not open to everyone. In totalitarian regimes, the ruling party usually comprises less than 10% of the overall population.
Only 10%.
Yeah, membership is a highly coveted privilege. It brings access to better food, better housing, and better jobs. But in exchange, it requires absolute, unquestioning conformity to the ideology. Over time, the party essentially swallows the government. The state bureaucracy just becomes an enforcement arm for the party's will.
To enforce that will, you need the third feature, which is perhaps the most horrific hallmark of totalitarianism: organized terror. We aren't just talking about a strict police force. We are talking about secret security apparatuses. The Gestapo in Nazi Germany, the NKVD in the Soviet Union, operating with absolutely zero judicial restraint.
No constitutions, no right to a lawyer, no habeas corpus, just secret arrest, torture in subterranean cells, and the constant lingering psychological terror of the knock at the door in the middle of the night. Hannah Arendt wrote extensively about this. The goal of totalitarian terror isn't just to punish criminals, it is to atomize society. It is to make everyone so terrified of being reported to the secret police by their own neighbors or even their own children that all trust evaporates. People isolate themselves entirely.
And the terror was weaponized against entire demographics. It wasn't just about what you did, it was about who you were. The Nazis targeted Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, and political dissidents for absolute extermination. The Soviets targeted kulaks, wealthy peasants, clergy, capitalists, and anyone deemed socially undesirable. The death tolls are practically incomprehensible.
Oh, stagger.
Historians estimate perhaps 40 million people died under Mao, largely through state-engineered starvation during the Great Leap Forward, 11 million murdered in the Holocaust, up to 9 million dead under Stalin's purges and gulags. The sheer scale of the slaughter was designed to demonstrate the state's absolute godlike power and the individual's total, meaningless helplessness.
To maintain the illusion that this slaughter was actually building a utopia, the regime absolutely requires the fourth feature: a monopoly of communications. The state seizes total control of every newspaper, every radio station, every film studio, and every publishing house.
I read about how in Nazi Germany, they actively produced and distributed cheap radio sets, the Volksempfänger, to the masses. But they were engineered so they could only pick up local German broadcasts. You physically could not tune into the BBC or foreign stations to hear the truth. The media becomes a pure propaganda organ. Only good news is allowed. Record harvests, glorious military parades, brilliant economic advancements.
And crucially, when reality inevitably conflicts with the propaganda, when the harvest fails and people are starving, the ideology dictates that it can never, ever be the fault of the great leader or the glorious system. So the media has to invent scapegoats. The failures are entirely blamed on sinister outside forces, foreign spies, or internal saboteurs actively ruining the machinery. The paranoia is constantly stoked.
Feature 5 is straightforward but essential for survival: a monopoly of weapons. The government systematically disarms the population, eliminating any physical possibility of an armed, organized resistance.
Right. And finally, feature 6, a controlled economy. The state seizes control of the economic engine of the nation.
Now, this took different forms. Under Stalin, it was direct, brutal state ownership. Private property was abolished. The central planners in Moscow tried to dictate the production of every single nail, tractor, and loaf of bread for the entire continent-spanning empire. Under Hitler, it was slightly different. Private industry technically still existed, but the Nazi Party coordinated it. They told the factory owners exactly what to produce, what prices to set, and who to hire.
Either way, the state dictates where the resources go. And what we see historically is that command economies can achieve very specific, massive goals by brute forcing resources. They can force rapid, bloody industrialization. They can build up massive war machines, but they do it at the absolute expense of the consumer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The ultimate irony of the Soviet system was that they possessed the technological brilliance to launch Sputnik and send the first human being into outer space, but their economic system was so incredibly inefficient that they couldn't produce enough basic shoes, toilet paper, or decent food for their citizens.
Which leads us to what I found to be the most surprising, almost darkly comedic part of our historical analysis. We have this terrifying image of the totalitarian state, this perfectly oiled, all-seeing, omnipotent machine right out of George Orwell's 1984. But when historians actually dug into the archives after these regimes fell, they revealed the grand illusion of total control. Behind the terrifying curtain, these regimes were often shockingly weak, chaotic, and disorganized.
It's a phenomenon inherent to systems built entirely on fear. Let's look at fascist Italy in the 1930s. Western visitors, even politicians, would travel to Rome, and they were mesmerized. They saw clean streets, massive public works projects, trains seemingly running on time, a profound sense of militaristic order. They completely bought into the myth that Mussolini was a supreme, omnipotent genius orchestrating every detail of Italian society.
But the reality was a complete shambles. The historical record shows that average Italians quietly ridiculed Mussolini. His grand economic plans were completely contradictory and failed constantly. And the most glaring proof of his weakness, look at how he fell. In 1943, as the Allies are invading Sicily and the war is lost, Mussolini isn't overthrown by a massive grassroots revolution. He is overthrown by his own Grand Council of Fascism.
His own people.
His own generals, who had spent years lying to him about military readiness because they were too terrified to tell him the truth, finally turn on him. And then the figurehead king of Italy simply summons Mussolini to the palace and fires him. What kind of omnipotent totalitarian dictator gets fired by a monarch who holds no actual power?
It exposes the rock at the core of the system. The Soviet example is equally revealing, and it persisted for decades. Every single Soviet premier, from Nikita Khrushchev to Mikhail Gorbachev, complained bitterly in their private memoirs about the massive, immovable bureaucracy, the rampant stagnation, and the sheer incompetence of the system. They had absolute dictatorial power on paper, but they couldn't actually make the factories run efficiently.
I was fascinated by the details of daily life for the Soviet workers. The central planning system was so profoundly broken and unrealistic that it bred massive systemic theft. Workers were routinely stealing raw materials from their factories just to survive on the black market. There were instances of workers stealing entire physical locomotives.
No way.
Yeah. Or they simply wouldn't show up. Absenteeism and rampant alcoholism on the factory floor were massive crises.
The state newspaper, Pravda, would thunder against these issues daily. They would publish angry editorials about hooliganism and shirkers. But the central planners in Moscow were completely powerless to stop it. The official planned economy was a fiction. The only thing that actually kept the Soviet people fed and clothed was the massive underground black market economy of favors and stolen goods.
This rot eventually breeds a highly specific type of corruption. This brings in Milovan Djilas, a Yugoslav communist who became disillusioned and wrote a famous critique called The New Class. Djilas pointed out that totalitarian regimes start with genuine, fanatical true believers, but over time those fanatics die out.
And what replaces them? Opportunists. The ruling Communist Party simply becomes a vehicle for career advancement. A young person in Moscow in 1975 didn't join the party because they were passionately reading Karl Marx and yearning for a workers' utopia. They joined the party because having a party membership card was the only way to get a permit for a slightly larger apartment, or the only way to get access to the special hidden grocery stores, the nomenclatura that actually had meat and fresh fruit.
The ideology becomes a hollow shell. Everyone knows it's a lie. The politicians know they're lying, the citizens know the politicians are lying, and the politicians know the citizens know. It breeds a deep, pervasive societal cynicism. And that unlimited corruption ultimately hollows out the regime from the inside until it simply collapses under its own weight, as we saw in 1989.
So pure totalitarianism, thankfully, mostly died out by the end of the 20th century because it was simply too brittle. The human spirit and the complexities of modern economics simply cannot be compressed into a perfect ideological box indefinitely. It tried to control too much, and the machine snapped.
But the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't mean the entire world suddenly blossomed into Jeffersonian democracies. Far from it. That brings us to Section 5, the authoritarian middle ground. And this is arguably the most important section for understanding the geopolitics of our world right now. Authoritarianism is very much alive. It is adapting, and it is thriving.
To understand modern authoritarianism, we have to clearly distinguish it from the totalitarian nightmare we just described. And the best framework for this comes from Jeane Kirkpatrick, a political scientist who later served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in the 1980s. She wrote a highly influential and highly controversial essay outlining a fundamental structural difference between these regimes.
Kirkpatrick argued that authoritarian regimes which are governed by a small elite, usually a military junta, a monarch, or a single dictator, are definitely oppressive. They completely minimize or eliminate popular democratic input. If you try to form an opposition political party, you will be thrown in jail. But, and this is the key distinction, they don't try to control everything.
Exactly. Authoritarian regimes lack that all-encompassing utopian ideology. They don't want to remold the human soul. They are primarily concerned with maintaining power, maintaining order, and extracting wealth. Therefore, they largely leave the social, cultural, religious, and familial aspects of life alone, provided those spheres do not challenge the state. You can go to church, you can run a small business, you can raise your family however you want. You can do all that as long as you stay entirely out of politics.
And Kirkpatrick made a deeply controversial geopolitical argument based on this distinction. She argued that because authoritarian regimes don't attempt to violently rewire the entire fabric of society, they actually retain the structural capacity to reform. A military dictatorship in a place like Chile under Pinochet or Brazil or Argentina in the 1970s and 80s could eventually, slowly, step down, hand power back to civilians, and allow a transition to democracy. The underlying societal structures, property rights, religious institutions were still intact.
But, she argued, totalitarian regimes cannot reform. They are so incredibly rigid, their ideology claims to be so perfectly infallible, that if they attempt to bend, they shatter.
And history largely vindicated her on that specific point. Look at what happened when Mikhail Gorbachev took over the Soviet Union. He recognized the economy was dying. He tried to introduce small, measured, free market reforms, perestroika, and a little bit of free speech glasnost, just to save the system. He thought he could tinker with the machine.
But once you admit that even one tiny part of an absolute, infallible ideology is wrong, the entire house of cards collapses. Once citizens realized they could criticize the state without instantly being sent to the gulag, all the pent-up rage of 70 years exploded and the Soviet Union dissolved with breathtaking speed.
But the autocrats of the world learned a very valuable lesson from the fall of the Soviet Union. They realized that command economies doom you to failure, but full democracy threatens your power. So they evolved. Today, we are seeing the rise of a highly potent, highly resilient new model, authoritarian capitalism. And China is the absolute master of this system.
It is a profoundly effective, highly specific bargain struck between the state and the citizens. The government says, look, we abandon the insane economic controls of Mao. We will embrace global capitalism. We will allow you to start tech companies, to build factories, to get rich, to buy luxury cars, to travel to Paris on vacation, and to drastically raise your family's living standard.
But in exchange for this economic freedom, you surrender all political rights. You do not ask for a vote, you do not criticize the party leadership, and you stay entirely out of the political sphere.
It is a strict transaction, and for a remarkably long time, it has worked. If an authoritarian regime is delivering 8 or 10% economic growth year over year, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of crushing poverty into a comfortable middle class, the vast majority of citizens will pragmatically accept the lack of democratic rights. They are too busy getting wealthy and enjoying their new lives to risk it all on a political revolution.
But this brings up the most crucial, looming question in political science today, the Achilles heel of authoritarian capitalism. What happens when the economic miracle stops?
That is the terror keeping autocrats awake at night. No economy grows at 10% forever. Demographics change, debt bubbles burst, trade wars happen. When the regime can no longer fulfill its end of the bargain, when youth unemployment skyrockets and living standards stagnate, they lose their primary source of legitimacy.
And what do they fall back on? If you can't offer wealth and you can't offer freedom, what tool is left in the dictator's toolbox? Nationalism. Often highly aggressive, militaristic nationalism. You start saber-rattling against your neighbors, you blame foreign powers for your economic woes, and you demand patriotic unity to distract the angry public. It makes authoritarian capitalist regimes incredibly dangerous when their economies begin to falter.
We also have to examine another massive swath of the authoritarian landscape, the developing nations. Specifically, why did authoritarianism become the dominant form of government in the post-colonial Third World? Following World War II, as the British, French, and European empires finally collapsed, dozens of newly independent nations were born across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And initially, almost all of them adopted beautiful, democratic constitutions modeled on Western parliaments.
But within a decade, almost all of those democracies had crumbled into military juntas or single-party dictatorships. Why did it fail so universally? It wasn't because the people in those nations didn't want freedom. Political scientists argue it's because these newly drawn nations completely lacked the specific, deep societal soil that allowed Western democracy to grow over centuries.
Democracy in the West evolved alongside the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the rise of a massive independent middle class built on competitive market economies and strong individual property rights. But the post-colonial nations were largely pre-industrial agrarian societies. Their social structures were historically focused heavily on tribe, clan, and extended family, rather than the concept of the individual citizen.
Furthermore, we have to look at the legacy of the colonizers themselves. The British and the French didn't practice democracy in their colonies. They ruled through absolute military force, economic extraction, and dividing ethnic groups against each other to maintain control. So when the colonial powers left, there was absolutely no institutional memory of democratic compromise.
And many of the new post-colonial leaders, charismatic figures who had led the independence movements, had studied in Europe during the 1930s and 40s. They absorbed socialist and centrally planned economic ideologies. When they took power, they looked at their desperately poor, fractured nations and argued that democracy was a luxury they simply couldn't afford.
The argument was basically, we are 50 years behind the West. We need to build dams, roads, and factories immediately. We cannot waste time on messy, endless parliamentary debates and tribal squabbling. We need centralized, absolute power to unify the nation and force modernization. So they rigged the elections, claimed they alone knew what was best for the people, and established single-party authoritarian rule.
And the tragic reality is that the results were almost universally disastrous. Without the feedback loop of democratic accountability and without the efficiency of a free market, these governments engaged in incredibly wasteful utopian projects.
Julius Nyerere in Tanzania is a heartbreaking example. He was an idealistic leader, not a bloodthirsty tyrant. But he forced a policy called Ujamaa, which involved moving millions of peasant farmers into collective villages to modernize agriculture. It was a complete disaster. It disrupted traditional farming, destroyed productivity, and transformed Tanzania from a food exporter to a nation dependent on international food aid.
And the lack of accountability inevitably led to explosive corruption. Without a free press to expose theft, government officials treated the national treasury as a personal bank account. Heavy regulations stifled individual entrepreneurs. Nations like Myanmar and Zaire basically impoverished themselves despite massive natural resources.
Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, is the ultimate tragedy of this post-colonial trap. Zimbabwe achieved independence in 1980 with a relatively strong agricultural economy and a democratic constitution. But Mugabe, hungry for absolute power, used North Korean-trained military units from his dominant Shona tribe to brutally crush the opposition in the minority Ndebele regions. He established a violent authoritarian system under the guise of maintaining unity.
And the economic consequences were apocalyptic. To maintain support among his cronies, Mugabe violently seized commercial farms, destroying the agricultural sector. The economy went into a death spiral. To pay the military, he just printed money, leading to hyperinflation that literally hit percentages in the millions. People were carrying around trillion-dollar banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Mass unemployment, starvation, and millions of refugees fleeing the country. It is a stark lesson in how authoritarianism, promising rapid development, usually delivers ruin.
Which brings us to the most difficult, delicate phase of geopolitics and our final major topic. Section 6, the delicate transition. Let's say an authoritarian regime finally falls. The dictator flees, or the military steps down. The country wants to become a democracy. How do they actually survive the transition? Why do some democracies take root while others immediately slide back into chaos and dictatorship?
This is why we have to look closely at modernization theory. The core argument here is counterintuitive, but backed by a lot of historical data. Economic growth under a dictatorship actually accidentally fosters the conditions for democracy.
Fast-growing dictatorships in the late 20th century, places like South Korea, Taiwan, or Chile, under Pinochet, did not use command economies. They focused heavily on private market economies, integration with global trade, and massive exports. And by doing that, they unwittingly sowed the seeds of their own political demise.
Because when an economy grows rapidly and integrates with the global market, it inevitably creates something autocrats fear: a massive, highly educated, independent middle class. And the middle class is the absolute linchpin of democracy. The political sociologist Barrington Moore famously summarized this with the rule, no bourgeoisie, no democracy.
Why is the middle class so incredibly important? It's not just about having a certain amount of money in the bank. It changes your entire psychology and your relationship with the state. The middle class brings moderation. If you are a middle-class citizen, you likely own a home. You have a stable career. You have savings for your children's education. You have a profound stake in the stability of the system.
Exactly. You might be deeply unhappy with the government, and you might desperately want reform, but you do not want to burn the whole system down in a violent, chaotic revolution because you have too much to lose. You want predictable laws, you want property rights protected, and you want incremental change.
Furthermore, as the economy grows, education levels rise. Voters become significantly more sophisticated. They are exposed to international media and ideas. They are far less likely to fall for the emotional manipulation of extreme demagogues offering simple, magical solutions to complex problems. They start forming independent labor unions, business associations, and professional groups. The very pluralism we discussed earlier takes root. And most importantly, they pay taxes. When citizens are paying substantial taxes, they eventually refuse to be treated like children by a dictator. They demand a say in how their money is spent.
Taiwan is the ultimate success story of this theory. After the Chinese Civil War, Taiwan was ruled by a harsh authoritarian regime under martial law for decades, but the regime ruthlessly focused on export-driven economic growth. Over 30 years, they built a massive, wealthy, highly educated middle class. And gradually, the pressure from that middle class forced the regime to open up. Martial law was lifted, opposition parties were allowed, and by the year 2000, Taiwan safely and peacefully transitioned into one of the most vibrant, stable democracies in Asia. They grew the economic soil first, and the democracy blossomed from it.
But what happens if you try to skip the economic step? What happens if you try to thrust a fully functioning democracy onto a country that is deeply, desperately poor, highly unequal, and lacks any significant middle class?
Political scientists call this the danger of premature democracy, and it is incredibly volatile. If the vast majority of your population is starving, struggling just to survive the week, they do not care about abstract political concepts like the separation of powers or the freedom of the press. They care about food, shelter, and security.
The text highlighted a deeply sobering 2004 United Nations survey conducted across Latin America. A majority of the people surveyed explicitly stated that they would outright prefer a dictator who could guarantee food on the table over a democratically elected leader who respected human rights but couldn't fix the economy.
And that desperation makes the system incredibly vulnerable to demagogues. When you have masses of poor, economically insecure, often unsophisticated voters, politicians quickly realize that careful, nuanced policy debates don't win elections. What wins is whipping up the crowd with extreme emotional promises.
The demagogue vows to share the wealth. They blame the rich or foreigners or a minority group for all the suffering. They promise to instantly fix everything by seizing assets and handing out cash. And while that sounds incredibly appealing on a desperate campaign trail, once the demagogue actually takes power, the reality of economics hits. They usually wreck the economy with extravagant, unfunded spending and nationalization of industries.
We saw this vividly with Juan Perón in Argentina in the mid-20th century. He mobilized the impoverished working class, the descamisados, with massive wage hikes and social programs that the state simply couldn't afford. It sparked a devastating cycle of hyperinflation, economic collapse, and then military coups to restore order. We saw similar populism-driven economic ruin under Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. When the economy crashes under a populist demagogue, the military often steps in to stop the bleeding, and the premature democracy dies.
The structural requirement for an independent middle class also perfectly explains one of the most frustrating geopolitical puzzles,
Yeah.
the petrostate problem. Why is it that nations sitting on massive oceans of oil wealth almost never become stable democracies?
It's a fascinating phenomenon called rentier state theory. If you look at the data, none of the nations that derive 60% or more of their export income from oil or gas are democracies. None of them. Even the ones in the Persian Gulf with extraordinarily high per capita GDPs.
And the reason goes back to the middle class. Oil wealth is inherently concentrated. Pumping oil out of the ground doesn't require a massive, highly educated, diverse workforce like building a tech industry or a manufacturing base does. The wealth flows directly from the oil rigs into the coffers of the central government.
Which completely severs the normal relationship between a government and its citizens. In a normal country, the government has to tax the citizens to survive. And as the old American slogan goes, no taxation without representation. But a petrostate doesn't need to tax its citizens. It has billions of dollars of oil revenue.
So instead of taxing the people, the government essentially bribes them. They use the oil wealth to provide massive subsidies, free healthcare, guaranteed cushy government jobs, subsidized housing, zero income tax. The citizens become entirely dependent on the handouts of the state. Because they aren't paying taxes, they don't demand accountability or representation. The independent, self-reliant middle class that can challenge the state never forms because everyone's livelihood depends on keeping the autocrat happy, so the oil money keeps flowing.
Which brings us to the most sobering, tragic case study in recent history regarding the attempt to force a democratic transition, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
We have to unpack this because it is the ultimate example of ignoring every single political science principle we've discussed today. The Bush administration's stated goal, after the weapons of mass destruction didn't materialize, was to overthrow Saddam Hussein, plant a flourishing democracy in the heart of the Middle East, and assume that freedom would naturally spread to neighboring countries.
But geopolitical scholars were deeply, highly critical of this plan from the very beginning, because Iraq lacked virtually every single prerequisite for a stable democratic transition.
First, Iraq was largely an artificial country. Its borders were drawn by the British after World War I, forcing together three distinct groups that had deep historical animosities: the Sunni Arabs, the Shia Arabs, and the ethnic Kurds. There was no unified, overarching national identity. There was no tradition of pluralism or compromise.
Second, Saddam Hussein had ruled for decades through extreme totalitarian violence. He deliberately prevented the formation of an independent civil society. There were no independent judges, no free press, no moderating middle class. He ruled by terror, heavily favoring his own Sunni minority while brutally suppressing the Shia majority and the Kurds.
So what happens when the U.S. military swiftly removes the dictator, completely dismantles the Iraqi army and the Ba'athist bureaucracy, and then immediately pushes for democratic elections?
The result was entirely predictable to anyone studying regime transitions. The elections weren't a sudden embrace of liberal democratic values, they were a raw demographic census. The Shia majority, who had been brutally repressed for decades, naturally won the elections. And understandably but tragically, they used their new electoral majority to largely exclude and punish the Sunni minority.
They pulled the ladder up. They treated the election as a mandate for revenge, not a trusteeship for the nation. And the Sunnis, suddenly finding themselves marginalized, locked out of government jobs, and terrified for their safety, saw no reason to participate in this new democracy. They turned to violent insurgency. This sparked a horrific, years-long sectarian civil war that tore the country apart and eventually gave rise to extremist groups like ISIS.
The elections literally facilitated and calcified the sectarian violence. It proved the warning of Jeane Kirkpatrick, who cautioned against the deeply held, almost theological American belief that democracy can just be exported and installed anytime and anywhere under any circumstances. Iraq proved in blood that if the structural foundations, a middle class, a unified national identity, a basic culture of tolerance and rule of law are not present, thrusting elections onto a country can actually destroy it.
And we see a different kind of post-authoritarian struggle when we look at the post-communist reality. Why did a country like Poland largely succeed in its transition to a functioning democracy, while Russia, after a brief period of freedom in the 1990s, slid right back toward authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin?
It comes down to the sheer trauma of the economic transition and how much pain a society can endure before it begs for a strongman. Moving a nation from a centrally controlled socialist command economy to a free market capitalist system is incredibly brutal. It's called shock therapy. It inflicts terrible economic hardship in the short term. Prices skyrocket, state-run factories close, and millions lose their guaranteed jobs.
In Poland, the transition was painful, but the society had a strong sense of national unity, deep ties to the West, and a powerful organizing force in the Catholic Church to hold the social fabric together. But in Russia in the 1990s, it was absolute chaos. Ordinary Russians who had never known a free market and had no concept of investing or private ownership watched their life savings evaporate overnight in hyperinflation.
Meanwhile, a tiny group of ruthless insiders and former Soviet officials manipulated the chaotic privatization process to seize control of massive state assets, oil companies, aluminum smelters, television networks for pennies on the dollar. They became billionaires overnight. These were the oligarchs. The economy cratered, life expectancy plummeted, and organized crime exploded. It was a period of profound national humiliation and terror.
So, when Vladimir Putin emerged in 1999, the Russian people weren't yearning for Thomas Jefferson. They were yearning for stability. Putin promised order. He ruthlessly re-centralized control. He went after the oligarchs who opposed him, silencing the chaotic free press, and brought the energy sector back under state alignment. And the uncomfortable truth is that the majority of Russians enthusiastically supported him for it. They traded the chaotic, painful experiment of democracy for the predictable security of an autocrat.
It resulted in what political scientists bluntly term a kleptocracy, literally, rule by thieves. The democratic institutions, the courts, the parliament, the elections still exist on paper, but they are hollowed out. They serve only to enrich a favored circle of cronies around the strongman while ensuring true opposition can never organize.
It is an incredibly heavy, complex journey we've taken today. We have dismantled the logistical illusion of direct democracy and exposed the terrifying trap of illiberal democracies that use the ballot box to crush freedom. We've peered into the dark, incredibly brittle machinery of totalitarianism, where technology was used to try and remold the human soul. And we've explored the deeply fragile, precarious nature of true representative democracy, realizing that it rests almost entirely on the shoulders of an educated, independent, tax-paying middle class.
It is a lot to synthesize. But the goal here isn't just to memorize political science theories. It is to equip you with a new lens for viewing the world.
Exactly. For you, the listener, this is your toolkit. The next time you're scrolling through your news feed or watching a broadcast and you see a headline about a triumphant election in a developing nation or a new constitutional reform being passed in a transitional state, you now know how to look right past the ballot box. Don't just ask, did they vote? Voting is the easy part. Ask the hard questions. Ask, can the local press fiercely criticize the winner without their editor going to prison? Ask, is the judiciary actually independent, or are the judges just political appointees doing the leader's bidding? Ask, is there a robust independent middle class driving the economy, or is it a petrostate merely handing out bribes to keep the population quiet? That is how you decode the true nature of a regime.
It's about cultivating the ability to look at the underlying structural realities of power rather than being blinded by the political rhetoric.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative concept. It's a theory that essentially underpins modern international relations, called the democratic peace theory.
It's a very powerful, historically verifiable observation. The theory argues that, looking back through modern history, no two established true democracies have ever gone to full-scale war with each other. Democracies will absolutely fight dictatorships, often aggressively, but they do not fight one another.
The logic makes sense. In a democracy, the leaders are accountable to the public. And it is the public who has to pay the taxes to fund the war. And it is the public whose children come home in body bags. So democracies are inherently cautious about attacking other nations where the people also have a voice. They prefer to resolve disputes through diplomacy and trade.
But if that theory holds true, we can run a rather chilling thought experiment about the current state of our world.
Right now, across the globe, we are seeing established democracies showing profound signs of strain. We are seeing intense political polarization. Crucially, we are seeing the economic stagnation and shrinking of the middle class in many Western nations. And we are seeing a demonstrable slide in several countries backward toward illiberal or transitional territory.
Yeah. If the middle class is the anchor of democracy, and that anchor is actively eroding due to economic shifts, what does that mean for the democratic peace theory? If the number of true democracies begins to shrink and they slide backward into authoritarianism, does global peace unravel with them? Are we looking at a future where the decline of the middle class directly translates to a decline in global stability and an increase in war?
It is a heavy, monumental question. And it brings us right back to where we started, looking at the rain falling in Hong Kong as those flags changed in 1997. It reminds us that the systems governing our lives, ensuring our freedoms and our peace, aren't just permanent fixtures of engineering. They are fragile, living, breathing things. Democracy truly is contentious, it is contagious, but it is never, ever guaranteed. Something to deeply mull over until our next deep dive.